Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened to me last fall. I've always considered myself a pretty level-headed guy. 30 years in law enforcement will do that to you. I've stared down the barrel of a gun more times than I care to remember and handled it fine. But what happened in those mountains in northern Idaho, it was different. Something about it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. My buddy Mark and I had been planning this black bear bow hunting trip for months. We'd booked this guide, Hank Wilson, who had a reputation for knowing the backcountry like the back of his hand. He wasn't cheap, but Mark and I figured if we were traveling all the way to Idaho, we might as well do it right. Hank had set up 5 different bait stations scattered throughout this remote wilderness area. Some of them were a real pain in the ass to get to, like an hour and a half of straight uphill hiking from our base camp. By the time you'd reach some of these stands, your legs would be burning and you'd be sweating through your camo. But that's bow hunting for you. You got to put in the work. 4 of the stands were pretty much what you'd expect. There was always something going on, squirrels chittering, birds singing, the occasional deer wandering through. Normal forest sounds, you know, but there was this one stand. Man, it was different. The first time Hank took me there, I noticed it right away. The silence. It was just wrong. No birds, no squirrels, no bugs buzzing, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air. Even the wind moving through the trees seemed muffled somehow. The only real sound was this creek about 50 yards behind the stand, constantly rushing over the rocks. For some reason I can't explain, I kept going back to that stand. Maybe it was the challenge. We hadn't seen any bear sign there yet, or maybe it was just something pulling me back. I'd get there before daylight and stay until it was too dark. To see, just sitting there in that unnatural silence. It was day 4 of our 7-day hunt when it happened. I'd been at that same stand since before sunrise, and it was getting close to dusk. The light was starting to fade, and I was just passing time reading this thriller I'd brought along. I remember the exact moment. I was right in the middle of a chapter when this feeling washed over me. Someone was watching me. Not something. Someone. I can't really explain how I knew the difference, but I did. It wasn't like spotting a bear or elk watching you from the brush. This was deliberate, focused. I felt it drilling into the back of my head like a physical sensation. My heart rate shot through the roof. My mouth went bone dry in an instant. I'm not ashamed to admit that my hands started trembling so bad I couldn't even hold my book anymore. I set it down as quietly as I could and just froze. The feeling got stronger. Whatever was staring at me was behind me, up the slope in the thick timber. I know what you're thinking. Just turn around and look, right? But I couldn't. Not right away. It took every ounce of willpower I had to slowly turn my head and scan the forest behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified, like whatever was watching knew I was looking for it and was amused by my pathetic attempt. I tried to calm myself down. You're a cop, for Christ's sake, I remember thinking. You've faced down armed suspects without pissing yourself. But this was different. This wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're in danger. This was primal. Something buried deep in my brainstem was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I couldn't hear anything approaching over the sound of the creek. That's what made it worse. Whatever it was could be getting closer, and I'd have no way of knowing until it was right on top of me. The shadows were getting longer as the sun sank lower. I knew I should stay. Until full dark. That's prime time for bear movement, but sitting there with my back exposed to whatever it was, I just couldn't do it. I grabbed my bow and my pack and got down from that stand faster than I'd ever moved before. I didn't even bother being quiet about it. I just needed to get away. The hike back to camp was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me. I didn't stop once to catch my breath, even though my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. I just kept pushing forward, putting as much distance between me and that stand as possible. When I finally stumbled into camp, Mark and Hank gave me shit about coming back early. I made up some excuse about not feeling well. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what really happened. How do you tell two other grown men that you ran away from a feeling? I refused to go back to that stand for the rest of the trip. I made up reasons to hunt the other locations, even though Hank kept saying we should rotate through all the stands for the best chances. Mark must have thought I was being weird, but he didn't push it. We ended up having a successful hunt. Mark got a decent-sized black bear on the second to last day, and I managed to take a smaller one on our final morning. But even with the success, I couldn't shake what had happened at that stand. It wasn't until months later, when Mark and I were having beers and reminiscing about the trip, that I finally told him the truth about why I'd avoided that one location. His face went pale. "You felt it too?" he asked. Turns out, he'd been to that same stand the day before I had my experience. He hadn't stayed as long as I had. He'd bailed after just a couple of hours because of that exact same feeling, like something was watching him, stalking him. He said he'd never felt anything like it before, and he didn't tell anyone because he thought they'd think he was losing it. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the isolation or the unusual silence playing tricks on our minds, but the fact that we'd both experienced the exact same thing in the exact same spot without knowing about each other's experience, that was hard to explain away. I probably would have eventually filed the whole thing away as just a weird, unexplainable experience if it wasn't for what happened last summer. My family and I were spending a week at this cabin we rented near Forest Lakes, Arizona. Beautiful spot, really remote, right on the edge of the national forest. One night, my 15-year-old son, Tyler, woke me up around 1 in the morning. The kid was white as a sheet and shaking. He told me he'd gotten up to use the bathroom and had glanced out the window that faced the tree line. There, at the edge of where our yard light reached, he saw something walking. Not like a deer or elk, walking upright on 2 legs. According to Tyler, this thing was tall, well over 6 feet, and covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It was moving along the tree line when it suddenly stopped, like it sensed it was being watched. And then it turned its head and looked directly at the cabin window, directly at my son. "Dad, it saw me," he kept saying. "It looked right at me, and then it just kept going." Now, I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I'm a facts and evidence kind of guy. But the look on my son's face that night, combined with my own unexplainable experience in Idaho, it shook my worldview. I spent the rest of that night sitting up with my rifle across my lap, watching the tree line. Nothing showed up again, but I couldn't shake the connection between what happened to me in Idaho and what my son saw in Arizona. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that what was watching me that evening wasn't human. The feeling was too alien, too predatory, and yet too intelligent to be just an animal. I've tried researching similar experiences online. There are more than you'd think. Hunters and hikers describing that same feeling of being watched in remote areas, that same unnatural silence, that same overwhelming fear that seems to bypass all rational thought. I still hunt. I still spend time in the wilderness, but I'm different now, more aware, more cautious. I find myself listening more carefully to the sounds of the forest, or the lack of them. I'm more attentive to that primitive part of my brain, the part that senses danger before my conscious mind can process it. Something's out there in the wilderness, something that doesn't want to be seen, but occasionally makes its presence known. Something that watches us when we think we're alone. I don't know what it is, I can't prove anything. All I know is what I felt that day in Idaho and what my son saw in Arizona. And it's enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about what exists in the remote corners of our world. To this day, when I'm in the woods and that silence falls, when the birds stop singing and the squirrels disappear, I get that same sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. And I know it's time to leave. Because whatever was watching me that day, I'm certain of one thing: I don't ever want to see it face to face. Story 2. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened to me when I was 13. This was about 12 years ago now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. We lived in this old farmhouse outside Moorhead, Kentucky, proper middle of nowhere type place. Our closest neighbors were maybe half a mile down the road, and beyond that was just endless fields, woods, and hills. Growing up with two brothers in the countryside meant we were always getting into something. We'd find weird animal bones in the creek bed, hear strange noises at night, and tell each other scary stories about what might be lurking in the woods. But what happened that night in my bedroom wasn't just another spooky story. It was real, and it changed me. It was late October, probably around 11 at night. Mom had already gone to bed, and Dad was half asleep watching some old Western in the living room. My brothers were staying over at our cousin's place that weekend, so I had the upstairs to myself. I remember feeling pretty grown up about it at the time. My bedroom was this awkward, long, rectangle shape, kind of like a hallway with a bed in it. The window was on the same wall as the door, which was something I never thought much about until that night. I was lying in bed reading this fantasy book with a little clip-on reading light attached to the cover. It was one of those nights where the wind was really picking up outside, making the old house creak and groan. I remember hearing a scratching sound at first. It was so faint that I thought it might be a tree branch, or maybe one of the barn cats that sometimes climbed up the drain pipe. I tried to ignore it and focus on my book, but then it got more deliberate, like something was testing the window screen. Then it happened. There was this loud pop sound, and my window screen literally fell right into my room, landing in the middle of my bedroom floor with a clatter. I froze, my eyes locked on the now open window. The curtains billowed inward with a gust of wind, and for a second, that's all that happened. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to call out for my dad, but no sound would come out. I was just sitting there, book forgotten in my lap, staring at that window with this sense of absolute dread washing over me. That's when I saw it. This arm reached through the open window. I can't emphasize enough how wrong it looked. It was massive, way bigger than my dad's arm, and my dad was a pretty big guy. The arm was covered in this dark, coarse hair, and the hand at the end of it had these unnaturally long fingers that seemed to be feeling around the inside of my room, like it was searching for something. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. All I could do was stare as this thing, this impossible thing, invaded my bedroom. The fingers were spreading and contracting like they were trying to sense the air. They moved with this weird purpose that didn't seem animal but didn't seem human either. The worst part was that I was completely trapped. My bed was against the far wall, and to get to my bedroom door, I would have to walk right past the window, right past whatever was reaching into my room. The arm was between me and any chance of escape. I don't know how long I sat there paralyzed. It could have been 30 seconds or 10 minutes. Time just stopped making sense. The arm kept reaching, sometimes pulling back slightly only to extend further in, those fingers constantly moving in that searching pattern. It never came all the way into the room, just the arm up to about the elbow, but that was more than enough. My mind was racing with terrible possibilities. What if it was strong enough to break the whole window? What if there were more of them outside? What if it was just waiting for me to make a move? Eventually, the need to escape overrode my fear. I remember thinking, if I don't move now, I'm going to be stuck here all night. I took a deep breath, slid as quietly as possible to the edge of my bed, and put my feet on the floor. The wooden floorboards creaked, they always did, and the arms suddenly went completely still. That was somehow worse than the searching movements. Now, it was listening. I stood up, pressed my back against the wall opposite the window, and started inching toward the door. Every step felt like it took a year. I couldn't take my eyes off that hairy arm, and I swear it was turning slightly to track my movement, even though there wasn't a head attached to see me with. When I got to the point where I'd have to pass directly in front of the window, I hesitated. The arm was still there, completely motionless now. I thought about making a run for it, but the idea of passing within grabbing distance of that thing made my skin crawl. Then the arm suddenly jerked, like it was trying to reach further into the room, toward me. That was it. I bolted. I don't think my feet even touched the ground. I just launched myself past the window, yanked my door open, and ran down the hallway and stairs like the devil himself was chasing me. I found my dad in the living room, slumped in his recliner with the TV still on. I was gasping and crying, trying to explain what happened, but the words weren't coming out right. At first, he thought I'd had a nightmare, told me to calm down, that I was just scaring myself with those books I was reading. "Dad, there's something at my window," I finally managed to say. "It reached inside, its arm. It was trying to grab me." He gave me this look, part concern, part disbelief, but he got up anyway. "All right, let's go take a look." I didn't want to go back upstairs, but I didn't want to stay downstairs alone either, so I followed him, staying a few steps behind. When we got to my room, Dad flipped on the light, and there it was, my window screen lying in the middle of the floor, exactly where it had fallen. Dad's face changed. He went from humoring his scared kid to alert and concerned in an instant. "Stay here," he said, and went to check the window. He leaned out, looking in all directions, then closed and locked the window. "I don't see anything out there," he said, but I could tell from his voice that he was taking this seriously now. He went downstairs and got his flashlight and his shotgun. I stayed in the hallway while he went outside to look around. I watched from the upstairs window as the beam of his flashlight moved around the yard, illuminating patches of grass and the edge of the woods. He circled the entire house, checking the ground under all the windows. When he came back in, he looked troubled. "There's no footprints under your window," he said. "No ladder marks, nothing disturbed in the flower beds, but something definitely popped that screen out." He tried to reassure me, saying it might have been a raccoon, or maybe the wind caught the screen just right, but I could tell he didn't fully believe either explanation. The way that screen was installed, it would have taken considerable force to push it inward from the outside. I asked if I could sleep on the couch that night, and Dad agreed without hesitation. Before we went back downstairs, I grabbed my pillow and blanket, not wanting to spend another second in that room. The next morning, Dad went up to fix the screen. I went with him, didn't want to, but somehow being there while he fixed it seemed important. In the daylight, my room looked normal, safe even, but I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. Dad measured the screen and found it was intact, not bent or damaged, just completely popped out of its frame. "That's weird," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "These don't just fall in like this." That afternoon, I completely rearranged my room. I moved my bed to the opposite wall, as far from the window as possible. I put my dresser in front of the window, making it harder for anything to get through. Dad watched me do it without comment, even helped me move the heavier furniture. He understood, even if we weren't talking about why. For months afterward, I kept that window locked and covered with both blinds and heavy curtains. I stopped reading in bed. Instead, I'd read downstairs where Dad could see me, where I felt safe. I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside my bed just in case. My brothers teased me when they got back from our cousin's place, especially when they saw how I'd rearranged the room. But even they stopped joking about it when they saw how serious I was. They'd seen me scared before. We'd all scared each other plenty of times. But this was different. This wasn't fun scared or even normal scared. This was something else. To this day, I've never figured out what reached into my room that night. I've gone over it again and again in my head, trying to find some rational explanation. Could it have been a bear? We did have black bears in Kentucky, but they weren't common around our place, and the arm I saw didn't move like a bear's. A person in a costume. But why, and how did they reach my second-story window without leaving any evidence? I'm 25 now, living in an apartment in the city with normal neighbors and streetlights outside. But sometimes, when the wind picks up at night, I still check my windows to make sure they're locked. I still sleep with my bed positioned where I can see the entire room. And I still remember those fingers, those long, searching fingers attached to that impossibly hairy arm, reaching into what should have been the safest place in my world. Whatever it was, it changed something in me, made me realize that the boundary between the safe world and whatever lies beyond it is much thinner than we like to believe. Sometimes that boundary is as thin as a window screen on a dark October night. Story 3. I never thought I'd actually share this. I've told my wife and maybe 2 close friends, but they all think I'm either exaggerating or flat out making it up. I'm not. I wish I was. What happened to me in Mariposa Swamp back in 2014 still gives me cold sweats when I think about it too much. For context, I'm not some teenager looking for attention or a horror movie junkie with an overactive imagination. I'm a 50-year-old guy who owns an auto repair shop in Metairie. I fix cars for a living. I deal in facts, broken parts, and fixing things that make sense. What I saw that night doesn't make any damn sense. After Katrina hit back in 2005, my parents lost everything in New Orleans and had to relocate to Albany. I'd visit them every couple months, usually taking my truck. But that fall, I'd just gotten into motorcycling. Nothing fancy, just a used Harley I'd been fixing up. I loved the freedom of it, the wind, the feeling of being completely present on the road. My wife thought it was a midlife crisis thing. Maybe it was, but it made me happy. That particular night, I was heading back from visiting my folks. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., and I decided to take Highway 51 instead of the interstate. Seemed safer at night on the bike, less traffic, and I wasn't in any particular hurry. The road cuts right through Mariposa Swamp Wildlife Management Area. Beautiful during the day, but at night, different story. It was a clear night, good weather for riding with a nearly full moon. About 6 miles into the wildlife area, I felt that familiar pressure in my bladder. You know how it is. You think you can make it home, then suddenly you absolutely can't. I'd had a couple beers with dinner at my parents' place, nothing that would impair my driving, but enough to make my bladder pretty insistent. So I pulled over to the side of the road. There were no streetlights out there, just darkness broken up by my bike's headlight. I could hear the distant sounds of cars passing on the elevated interstate maybe half a mile away, but otherwise it was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for any sound. I walked a few feet from my bike toward the edge of the road where it met the swamp. I wasn't about to wade into that mess. Snakes, gators, who knows what else. But I needed some privacy from the road, not that any cars had passed in the last 10 minutes. That's when I first noticed the smell. If you've ever been fishing and left the catch out too long in the sun, it was like that but worse. Sort of rotten and fishy and something else I couldn't place. I figured it was just swamp stink. People fish there all the time, probably toss their unwanted catches. Back, that kind of thing. I was doing my business, staring straight ahead into the darkness, when I noticed what I thought was a willow tree about 20 feet away. The moonlight was catching it just enough that I could make out its silhouette. Except, and this is when my heart first skipped, willow trees don't suddenly move on their own. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear. We get black bears in Louisiana, and they can stand up pretty tall. But this thing was massive, too tall, too wide to be any bear I've ever seen or heard of. I froze, completely froze, couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even finish peeing. The stream just stopped mid-flow as my body went into some primal fear response. Whatever it was, and I still don't have a name for it, stood up from what looked like a crouching position. It must have been about 9 feet tall. Not exaggerating. 9 feet at least, and maybe 4 feet wide at the shoulders. In the moonlight, all I could make out was a silhouette, but it had what looked like long hair or fur hanging down. Then it moved. Jesus Christ, it moved so fast for something so big. It crossed the road in 2 strides to cover a 2-lane highway. As it passed in front of me, not 20 feet away, it made this sound. I don't even know how to describe it properly. Like a wet flatulence followed by this deep, guttural grunt that felt like it vibrated in my chest. I swear I could feel the concrete vibrating under my boots as it crossed. The smell hit me full force then, that fishy rot smell but 100 times stronger, mixed with something musky and primitive. It made my eyes water and my stomach heave. I had this absurd thought in that moment. I'd interrupted it while it was taking a dump or something, like I'd violated its privacy, and it was annoyed. Why else would it make those sounds, be giving off that smell? It's crazy, I know, but in that instant my brain was scrambling to make this thing make sense. It disappeared into the swamp on the other side of the road. Just gone. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that quietly, that quickly. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, my pants still unzipped, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack a rib. When I finally could move again, I practically leapt back to my bike. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing charging at me from the darkness. I gunned it out of there, probably doing 80 on a 55 stretch, not caring if there were cops. A ticket would have been welcome compared to whatever the hell was back there. The whole way home, I kept going over what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a really tall person in some kind of ghillie suit, but no person moves like that. No person smells like that. And what would someone be doing out in the middle of Mariposa swamp at 10 at night? I didn't tell my wife when I got home. How could I? Hey, honey, I think I saw Bigfoot taking a dump in the swamp. She already thought the motorcycle was me losing my mind a little. This would confirm it. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the beers, the moonlight playing tricks, exhaustion from the long ride. But then I noticed my riding boots by the door. There was mud on them that hadn't been there before, and when I bent down to move them, that smell was still there. Faint, but unmistakable. That fishy, musky rot. I threw the boots in the outdoor trash can. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that thing. In my dreams, it would follow me home, peer through our bedroom window with eyes I never actually saw in real life. I'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced I could smell it in our house. I've never taken Highway 51 through Mariposa Swamp again. I'll add 45 minutes to my trip to avoid it. I've never gone motorcycling at night since then either. Sold the bike 3 months later, told my wife I lost interest. The truth is, I lost my nerve. I've done some research since then. Looked up local legends, cryptids, anything that might explain what I saw. There are stories about the rougarou in Cajun country, but that's supposed to be more like a werewolf. This wasn't that. The closest thing I've found is some old accounts from loggers in the 1920s who refused to work certain areas of the Louisiana swamps because of what they called stink men, tall creatures that gave off terrible odors and made weird noises. Most people write these off as campfire stories meant to scare newcomers, but I'm not so sure anymore. I've thought about going back there in daylight, maybe with a friend, to look for evidence. Footprints, hair, anything. But something stops me every time I consider it. It's like my body remembers the fear, even when my mind tries to be rational. Whatever I saw that night wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I know of. It was something other. Something that's probably been there in that swamp for God knows how long, doing whatever it does in the darkness where people rarely go. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and I hear something outside, a branch scraping against the house, a raccoon in the trash cans, I hold my breath and wait, half expecting to catch that smell again, that fishy, musky rot, and I wonder if it somehow followed me home after all. I still can't explain what I saw in Mariposa swamp that night. I don't think I ever will. All I know is that I'm never going back there after dark. And if you're ever riding through on Highway 51 at night and feel the need to pull over, don't. Just keep going. Whatever's waiting in that darkness, it's been there a lot longer than we have, and it probably doesn't appreciate the company. Story 4. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family. Even now, 16 years later, my hands are shaking as I type this out. My wife Sarah and I have gone back and forth for years about whether to tell anyone what happened that night in the spring of 2006. We've only recently moved away from our home outside Greenville, Maine, and I guess that's what finally gave me the courage to write this down. We bought that house back in 2004. It was everything we wanted, private, affordable, with amazing views of the surrounding forest. The locals called our road the Deep Line because it was literally where civilization ended and the North Woods began. Our nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and beyond our property was just unbroken wilderness stretching for about 25 miles. At first, the isolation was exactly what we wanted. I worked from home as a software developer, and Sarah was finishing her dissertation. We loved hiking, and the wildlife was incredible. We'd see deer, foxes, the occasional moose. But there were other things too, things I can't explain even now. It started with sounds. About 6 months after we moved in, we began hearing these calls from the forest. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life. I know what wolves sound like, what coyotes sound like. These weren't those. They'd start off low and eerie, almost like a moan, then rise in pitch until they'd suddenly cut off. It wasn't a howl that faded. It was like someone hit a stop button mid-sound. Sarah and I would joke about it. The forest monsters are out tonight, we'd say, or sounds like the Maine Yeti is looking for a date. But we weren't really comfortable with it. The sounds came maybe once or twice a month, usually around dusk or very late at night. Always from deep in the trees, never close to the house. Until that night in April 2006, I remember it was a Wednesday because I'd had a big project deadline that day. I was exhausted and had gone to bed early, around 11:30. Sarah joined me about 20 minutes later. Our bedroom was on the second floor, with a window that faced the backyard and the forest beyond. The window was about 6 feet off the ground outside. I was almost asleep when Sarah whispered, "Tom, Tom, wake up." Her voice had this edge to it that instantly put me on alert. I didn't move, just opened my eyes. "What is it?" I whispered back. "There's something outside our window." I heard scratching. Now we'd had raccoons on our roof before, so my first thought was that it was just that. But when I turned to look at Sarah, the expression on her face made my stomach drop. She was staring at the window, completely rigid. "Listen," she said. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound against the window screen, not like branches scraping in the wind. This was deliberate, methodical, like something was testing the screen. Our curtains were partially closed, but there was a gap in the middle. I reached over to the nightstand, where we kept a flashlight and the switch for the exterior floodlights. My hand was shaking so badly, I nearly knocked the lamp over. "I'm going to turn on the lights," I told Sarah. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the window. I hit the switch for the floodlights. They illuminated the entire backyard, and what I saw in that moment is burned into my memory forever. 3 sets of eyes were staring in at us through the window, not at ground level, right at our window height, 6 feet off the ground. The reflections had this strange orange tint around the edges, almost like a corona. Each set was spaced about 5 to 8 inches apart, and they didn't blink when the lights came on. But it wasn't just eyes floating in darkness. The floodlights showed outlines, massive shadowy heads. One of them appeared to be stooping down just to peer through the upper part of our window. I could make out dark shapes of what looked like massive shoulders below the heads. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. Neither of us moved or spoke. It was like time froze. Then one of them, the one on the left, let out this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It was a harsh, two-syllable shriek that literally made the windows vibrate. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. It wasn't like anything that should exist in this world. The instant after that sound, all three figures turned away simultaneously. I could see the movement clearly. They turned and dropped from view. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, not four-legged running, but bipedal strides, thudding against the ground as they raced toward the tree line. The motion floodlights at the edge of our property triggered as they passed, giving me one last glimpse of three large, dark figures moving on two legs before they disappeared into the forest. What the fuck was that? Sarah was crying now, her nails digging into my arm. Tom, what the fuck was that? I couldn't answer her. My mouth was dry, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. We sat there for at least 5 minutes, neither of us moving. I need to check outside, I finally said. No, Sarah grabbed me. Don't go out there. I'm not going into the woods, I promised her. Just the yard. I need to see if there's anything. I got my shotgun from the closet. I'd never needed it for anything more than scaring off the occasional black bear, but right then I was grateful for every shell in the magazine. I also grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight. Sarah insisted on coming with me, so we both went downstairs. We turned on every light in the house. I remember how my hand shook as I unlocked the back door. The floodlights were still on, illuminating our yard all the way to the tree line about 50 yards away. Stay on the porch, I told Sarah. She nodded, holding a kitchen knife I hadn't even seen her grab. I stepped into the yard, shotgun ready, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. The night was quiet, now except for the normal cricket sounds. No strange calls, no footsteps, nothing. When I reached the area below our bedroom window, I found the first evidence that I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. The grass was flattened in 3 distinct areas, like something heavy had been standing there. And when I looked up at our window, I could see the screen was slightly bent inward, as if something had been pressing against it. I walked the perimeter of our yard, checking for any other signs. At the edge where our lawn met the forest, I found what looked like footprints in the softer soil. They were large, much bigger than my size 11 boots, and deep, like whatever made them was very heavy. But they weren't clear enough for me to make out any details, just depressions in the ground leading into the trees. I wasn't about to follow them into the forest at midnight. When I came back to the porch, Sarah was shivering despite the mild spring night. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "The screen's bent," I told her, "and there are some tracks, but nothing clear." We went back inside and double-checked every lock in the house. I pulled the heavy bookcase from the hall and pushed it in front of the back door. We called the local sheriff's department, but when I tried to explain what we'd seen, the deputy on duty clearly thought we'd either been drinking or had seen some bears standing on their hind legs. "Bears don't have eyes that reflect orange," I insisted, "and they don't run on 2 legs into the forest." "Could have been people playing a prank," he suggested. "Some of the local kids like to scare the out-of-staters, but I knew better. No local kids could have made that sound that shook our windows, and no human I've ever seen has eyes that reflect like that." We didn't sleep that night, or much for the next week. I installed motion sensor cameras all around our property the very next day, and we bought a second shotgun for Sarah. For the next month, we jumped at every sound. The strangest part, we continued to hear those same vocalizations from the forest. Sometimes they seemed closer, sometimes further away, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes at dusk. But we never saw those creatures again, not directly. One of our motion cameras did capture something about 2 weeks after the incident. A dark, tall figure at the edge of our property. The image was blurry, and partially obscured by branches. But whatever it was big and standing upright. When I zoomed in on the photo, there was that same orange eye shine. We debated moving immediately, but our financial situation wouldn't allow it. So we stayed, living in a state of constant vigilance for years. We avoided going outside after dark. We kept weapons near every door. The strange calls continued periodically, but always from deep in the forest, never right outside our home again. I've researched extensively since then. Cryptid sightings, unexplained phenomena in northern Maine, Native American legends about the region. I've found hints and similar accounts, but nothing that fully explains what we experienced. To this day, I don't know what visited us that night. I don't know why they were looking in our window or what they wanted. But I know what I saw, and I know that sound will haunt me for the rest of my life. We finally moved away last month. I still wake up sometimes, heart racing, thinking I hear scratching at the window. Sarah still doesn't like to talk about it. But whatever they were, they're still out there in those woods. So if you're ever driving along the back roads outside Greenville and the locals tell you you're crossing the deep line, maybe turn around and find somewhere else to live. Story 5. I still can't explain what I saw that day. It's been almost 3 decades, but the memory remains crystal clear, like it happened yesterday. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I've just made eye contact with those eyes again. It was the summer of '96, right after I'd graduated high school. That whole summer felt endless, the kind where days melt together and you think you're invincible. Me and my buddies, Jake, Derek, and Chris, spent most of our free time riding dirt bikes through the woods around Marquette, Michigan. We were all working summer jobs, saving up for college, but weekends were sacred. Those were our days to escape. Our favorite spot was this stretch of abandoned highway, the old Highway 553. The new one had been built parallel to it maybe a decade earlier, and the old road was basically forgotten. Nature was slowly reclaiming it, cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through, fallen trees blocking sections, and stretches where the forest seemed to be swallowing the pavement whole. It was perfect for dirt bikes because nobody else used it, and the obstacles made it challenging. This particular day was sweltering, late July, mid-80s, with that heavy upper peninsula humidity that makes the air feel like soup. We'd been riding for maybe 2 hours, taking turns leading the pack. I was up front when we approached a section where a massive pine had fallen across the road. It wasn't anything unusual. We'd either ride around these obstacles or use them as jumps if they weren't too big. I slowed down as we approached the tree, scanning for the best way around, when something caught my eye to the right. Just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. My first thought was that it was a deer. We saw them all the time. But when I turned to look, I immediately knew it wasn't a deer, not even close. There was something crouched low to the ground about 30 yards away, partially hidden by undergrowth. It seemed to be watching the active highway beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out details at first, just a dark mass that was definitely not a tree stump or a rock. As my bike got closer, the noise must have alerted it because it slowly began to stand up. That's when my blood ran cold. This thing was standing on 2 legs. I hit the brakes so hard my back tire skidded. The creature was now moving cautiously toward the middle of the abandoned road, still hunched over like it was trying to stay hidden. But there was nothing to hide behind in the middle of the road, and I was maybe 50 feet away, staring right at it. When it stopped and turned to face me directly, time seemed to freeze. I remember feeling like my heart had actually stopped beating. My hands were locked on the handlebars, knuckles white. I couldn't move. The thing that struck me immediately was its size. It stood maybe 6.5 to 7 feet tall, even with its hunched posture. It was covered in this dark, matted fur that wasn't black, but more of a dark brown, similar to the dull color of a moose's coat. But it wasn't a moose. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or could identify. Its body structure was all wrong for any animal native to Michigan. The proportions were disturbing. Arms that hung too long, reaching almost to its knees. The build reminded me of a gorilla, but leaner, with powerful shoulders and a broad chest that tapered to narrower hips. But we don't have gorillas in the Upper Peninsula. We don't have anything like this. Those eyes, though, that's what keeps me up at night even now. I couldn't make out much of its face through the fur, but the eyes caught the sunlight in a way that made them appear to glow. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. There was something behind them, awareness, intelligence. It was looking at me like it was assessing me, not just reacting to my presence. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it glanced over its right shoulder at the embankment beside the road. The old highway was cut into the hillside, creating a steep 6 to 8 foot slope. I realized it was calculating, actually thinking about how to escape. When it turned back to me, I finally found my voice and started shouting, "Guys, guys, do you see that?" I could hear my friends' bikes coming up behind me, their engines getting louder as they approached. The creature held my gaze for maybe 5 more seconds. There was no aggression in its posture, just what I can only describe as intense curiosity mixed with caution. Then, as my friends pulled up beside me, it began to move toward the embankment. "What the hell is that?" I heard Jake yell from somewhere behind me. What happened next is something I still struggle to explain. This creature, this thing that must have weighed at least 300 pounds, suddenly lunged at the steep embankment and scaled it in what seemed like a single bound. The power in its limbs was unreal. I've seen bears climb, I've seen deer leap, but this was different. It moved with purpose and precision that seemed impossible for its size. For a split second, I lost sight of it as it crested the top of the embankment. Then I caught glimpses of it moving through the trees. It was running on 2 legs, weaving between trunks with unbelievable agility. At one point, it came to a fallen tree, a big one, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and it just leaped over it, like an Olympic hurdler. Then it disappeared into the denser forest beyond. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. I turned to look at my friends, and their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They'd seen it too. What the actual fuck was that? Derek's face was pale, his hands gripping his handlebars so tight I could see his knuckles whitening even through his gloves. "A bear?" Chris suggested, but it sounded more like a desperate hope than a real theory. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs like that," Jake said quietly, "and they sure as hell don't run like that." We sat there on our bikes for what must have been 5 minutes, just staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. None of us wanted to be the first to move. It was like we were afraid that if we acknowledged what had just happened, we'd have to accept that the world wasn't what we thought it was. Finally, Derek said, "Should we go look? Maybe try to track it?" The suggestion made my stomach twist. "No way," I said immediately. "Did you see how fast that thing moved? How strong it was? We wouldn't stand a chance if it decided it didn't want to be followed." Nobody argued with me. We turned around and headed back the way we came, riding close together and much faster than was safe on that cracked, overgrown pavement. Nobody wanted to be left behind. The usual joking and trash talk was gone, replaced by tense silence, broken only by the roar of our engines. Back at the parking area where we'd left our truck and trailer, we finally started talking about it. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear with mange that made it look strange. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe it was just a weird angle that made a normal animal look bipedal. But we all knew those explanations didn't fit. A person in a costume couldn't move like that. No known animal in Michigan matched what we'd seen. And all 4 of us had seen the same thing. It wasn't a trick of the light or an optical illusion. "We should report it," Chris suggested, "to the DNR or something." Jake laughed, but it was hollow. "And tell them what? That we saw Bigfoot? They'd drug test us all." "It wasn't Bigfoot," I said, though I wasn't sure why I felt so certain about that. Bigfoot's supposed to be more human-looking. This was different, more animal, but not any animal that's supposed to be here. We eventually agreed not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. So we made a pact to keep it between us, and for the most part, we've stuck to that pact. I've never even told my wife the full story. But that wasn't the end of it. Not for me, at least. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I started researching, spending hours at the library. This was before Google made research easy, looking into local legends, cryptid sightings, anything that might explain what we'd encountered. I found some old newspaper clippings from the 70s about strange animal sightings in the same general area. A few hunters had reported seeing unusual wildlife, but the details were vague. There were some Ojibwe legends about forest spirits that walked on two legs, but nothing specific enough to match what we'd seen. The strangest thing I found was a report from 1978 where a forestry worker claimed to have found unidentifiable tracks near an old logging road about 10 miles from where we'd had our encounter. The article mentioned that the tracks were photographed and reported to the DNR, but I couldn't find any follow-up story or any mention of what came of the investigation. I went back to that stretch of Highway 553 a few weeks later, alone. I told myself I was just going for a ride, but I knew I was hoping to see it again. I needed confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I spent hours riding up and down that abandoned road, stopping frequently to scan the surroundings, but there was nothing. Just the normal sounds of the forest and occasional wildlife. Deer, squirrels, birds. Nothing unusual. It's been almost 30 years and I've never seen anything like it again. My friends and I don't talk about it much anymore. When we do get together and the subject comes up, usually after a few beers, there's still this unspoken agreement not to dig too deep. It's like we're all afraid that if we examine the memory too closely, we'll either have to admit we were somehow mistaken, or worse, accept that there are things in those woods that science can't explain, but I know what I saw. Sometimes when I'm out hiking or camping in the UP, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if it's watching me. And sometimes, when the wind stops and the forest goes quiet, I could swear I feel eyes on me. Intelligent, curious eyes that shouldn't exist in any animal known to inhabit these woods. I still don't have answers. I probably never will. But I know that for those few seconds on that summer day in '96, I locked eyes with something that shouldn't exist. Something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and what might be watching from the shadows. Story 6. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened last summer. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and I still can't explain it. I've only told a few people about this, and most of them think I'm either crazy or was seeing things. But I know what I saw that night in Winston. It was a warm night in July, probably around 11 or so. Me and a couple buddies, Jason and Mike, were just hanging out in my grandma's driveway. She lives in this house that's pretty much surrounded by woods on all sides, except for where the driveway connects to the road. The property slopes down a bit, and at the bottom of the hill, there's this ditch where we throw yard waste and stuff. We were just chilling by my grandma's old van, talking about nothing important. Video games, some girl Mike was texting, normal stuff. My grandma had gone to bed hours ago, and it was that perfect kind of summer night where it's warm but not too sticky. The crickets were doing their thing, and every now and then we'd hear an owl somewhere in the trees. We'd been out there for maybe an hour and a half, and Jason was in the middle of telling this story about his boss at the grocery store when I noticed something moving by the ditch. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees moving in the breeze, but then, I don't even know how to describe this properly. Something, and I mean something, not someone, crawled out of that ditch. At first it was on all fours, and in the darkness I thought maybe it was a bear, which would have been scary enough. We get black bears around here sometimes, but they usually keep their distance. But then this thing, It stood up, on two legs, and it was huge, like easily over 7 feet tall. It wasn't just tall, though. It was massive, like football linebacker massive, but way bigger. The streetlight at the end of the driveway only gave off a dim glow, but it was enough for me to see that this thing was covered in this thick, black fur. Not like a coat or clothes, like actual fur growing from its body. The weirdest part, and this is what still gives me chills, was its shape. You know how people have distinct shoulders and a neck? This thing didn't. Its head seemed to just round into its shoulders, like there wasn't a clear separation. It looked wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that's hard to explain. As soon as it stood up, this thing bolted. It ran down the driveway faster than anything I've ever seen move, heading toward the left side of the road. I was so shocked that for a second I couldn't even speak. Then I started yelling, "Hey, who is that? What are you doing here?" I kept repeating it, getting louder each time, but it didn't even flinch or turn around. It was like it couldn't hear me or just didn't care. Jason and Mike were frozen. Jason had stopped mid-sentence and was just staring with his mouth open. Mike had dropped his phone on the gravel. Without thinking, I started after it. I don't know what I was planning to do. I guess I just wanted to see what the hell it was. I got maybe 20 feet down the driveway when some deep, primal part of my brain basically screamed at me to stop. It was like this overwhelming feeling of danger washed over me, and I just knew that following this thing was a terrible idea. What was I going to do if I caught up to it? What if it turned around? I stopped dead in my tracks and watched as it disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the road. From the direction it was heading, it was probably going toward the train tracks that run about a quarter-mile through the woods. When I turned around, Jason and Mike were still standing by the van, looking totally freaked out. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered. His face was pale, even in the dim light. Jason was shaking his head. "I don't know, man. That wasn't normal." We went inside after that. None of us wanted to stay outside anymore. We sat in my grandma's kitchen with all the lights on, speaking in hushed voices so we wouldn't wake her up. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume, or maybe we all just saw a bear and our minds played tricks on us. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear. The worst part came later that night. After the guys left, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head, thinking about how that thing moved. It wasn't like a person in a costume. The movements were too fluid, too natural, and it was fast, unnaturally fast. I kept picturing its weird, rounded shoulders and that thick, woolly fur. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside my window, a sort of heavy shuffling sound, like something big moving through the grass. My room is on the 2nd floor, but the thought that something might be out there, maybe looking up at my window, made me break out in a cold sweat. I couldn't bring myself to look. I just lay there, totally still, barely breathing until the sound stopped. The next morning I checked around the house. I found some weird depressions in the grass, almost like footprints, but bigger and deeper than any human would make. They led from the trees, circled the house once, and went back into the woods in the direction of those train tracks. I tried to take pictures, but they didn't come out clear. Enough. Just looked like random spots where the grass was pressed down. I asked my grandma if she'd heard anything strange during the night. She said no, but mentioned that the neighbor's dog had been barking like crazy around midnight and wouldn't stop for almost an hour. The neighbor had to bring him inside because he was going so nuts. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started researching online, looking up local wildlife, cryptids, even urban legends specific to Georgia. Nothing matched what we saw. There were some stories about Bigfoot sightings in North Georgia, but those descriptions didn't quite fit either. This thing was bulkier, and that weird shoulder-neck connection was something I'd never heard described before. I went back to the ditch where it had come from. I don't know what I expected to find, but I had to check. The ditch was just a ditch, full of old leaves, grass clippings, and a few broken branches. But at one spot, the side of the ditch was caved in, like something heavy had pulled itself up and out. About a week later, I was talking to this old guy who works at the hardware store in town. I didn't tell him what I saw, but I casually asked if there had ever been any strange animal sightings around Winston. He got this weird look on his face and asked why I wanted to know. I made up something about doing a school project on local folklore. He hesitated, then told me that back in the 80s, there were a bunch of reports about something in the woods near the train tracks. People described it as a large, bear-like creature that walked on two legs. The sightings stopped after a few months, and most people chalked it up to mass hysteria or maybe a black bear with some kind of deformity. But the way he talked about it, like he wasn't entirely convinced by the official explanation, made me think he might have seen something himself. That night, I had this vivid nightmare. I was standing in my grandma's driveway, alone. It was dark, but the moon was full and bright. I could see the ditch clearly, and something was moving inside it. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Then this thing pulled itself out and stood up. But this time, it turned and looked right at me. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it staring at me. And then it started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. After that dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might come back. I bought a trail camera with some money I'd saved up. I set it up facing the ditch, hoping to catch something, evidence that I wasn't crazy, that what I saw was real. Part of me hoped it would never show up on the camera, though. Part of me hoped I'd never have to see that thing again. It's been almost a year now, and I haven't seen it since that night. The trail camera has captured deer, raccoons, even a coyote once, but nothing unusual. But I still get nervous when I'm outside after dark. I used to walk home from my friend's house at night all the time, but now I always get a ride or make sure I'm home before sunset. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the ditch when I'm in the driveway, watching for movement. I listen more carefully to the sounds in the woods. Every unexplained noise makes me tense up. I've started carrying a heavy flashlight with me whenever I go out at night, though I'm not sure what good it would do if that thing decided to show up again. Jason and Mike don't talk about that night anymore. About a month after it happened, Mike suggested that maybe we all just saw a homeless person or something and got spooked. Jason seemed eager to agree. I think it's easier for them to believe that than to accept what we really saw. But they've both stopped hanging out at my grandma's place after dark. And neither of them walks home alone at night anymore either. I don't know what that thing was or where it came from. I don't know if it's still out there in the woods, somewhere, or if it was just passing through. Maybe it lives near those train tracks, or maybe it's moved on to somewhere else. All I know is that it was real, and it changed how I see the world. Before that night, I thought I knew what was possible and what wasn't. I thought the world made sense. Now I'm not so sure. If that thing exists, what else might be out there that we don't know about? What else might be hiding just beyond the trees, just out of sight? I still check the trail camera every week. So far, nothing, and honestly, I'm kind of relieved. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and I hear something moving outside, I wonder if it's back. I wonder if one day I'll look out my window and see that massive shape standing in the driveway looking up at me, and I wonder what I'd do if it did. Story 7. I've been hesitant to share this for years. People either think you're crazy or looking for attention when you talk about unexplained experiences in the wilderness. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has encountered something similar. I'm what most would consider an experienced outdoorsman. I've spent 20+ years hunting, fishing, and camping throughout Montana, particularly in Lewis and Clark counties. The wilderness there is vast and beautiful. Dense forests, steep ravines, crystal clear lakes, but there's something else out there. Something I can't explain. It started with sounds. I'd be in my tent or sitting by a campfire, and between 1 and 3 in the morning, I'd hear these noises. Not typical forest sounds, not owls or coyotes or anything I could identify after 2 decades in these woods. These were different, guttural growls that seemed to come from something large, piercing screams that didn't sound animal or human, and howls that made the hair on my neck stand up, sometimes accompanied by this rhythmic wood beating, like something pounding a stick against trees in a deliberate pattern. For years, I dismissed it. Wind plays tricks, sound carries strangely in mountain valleys. But then I started noticing other things. Movement at the edges of my vision. Large figures moving quickly between trees, always just outside the range where I could see them clearly. Dark silhouettes that were too big to be a person, moving too fast to be a bear. I'd grab my flashlight and investigate, heart pounding, but I'd never find footprints. Just strange scratches on trees, way higher than a human could reach, 7, 8 feet up the trunk. The marks were deep, like something with significant strength had gouged the bark. Black bears aren't common in those specific areas, and grizzlies that could make such marks are increasingly rare. Whatever was making those scratches wasn't documented in any wildlife manual I'd ever read. The most unsettling incident happened 5 years ago near Blackfoot Lake. My buddy Cameron and I had set up camp beside this abandoned gravel pit. It was an odd spot, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest on one side, and these steep, almost cliff-like embankments on the others, with a couple of small ponds nearby. Perfect spot for fishing, we thought. As evening approached, the temperature dropped to around 40 degrees. We were sitting by our fire when this smell hit us, powerful enough that we both noticed it simultaneously. I've smelled plenty of wildlife, but this was different, like wet dog fur mixed with skunk spray and something rotten underneath. It was coming from across one of the ponds, from a heavily wooded area. "You smell that?" Cameron asked, already reaching for his rifle. I nodded, grabbing my shotgun. The smell was so strong it felt deliberate, like whatever was making it wanted us to know it was there. We decided to investigate. There was a narrow path around the pond, maybe 4 feet wide, with water on one side and a steep embankment on the other. We were about halfway, across, when we heard it. Deep, aggressive growls coming from the tree line ahead of us. Not a bear's growl. Lower, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something with a much larger chest cavity. Before we could even process that, the bushes and young trees at the edge of the forest began shaking violently, not swaying in the wind, being physically thrashed back and forth. Something big was moving through them, staying just out of sight. It was a warning, clear as day. This was territory we weren't welcome in. We backed away slowly, then hurried back to our campsite. The logical part of my brain was running through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion, maybe even wolves. But none fit what we'd just experienced. The growl was wrong, the smell was wrong, the deliberate warning was wrong. We decided to pack up and leave in the morning. Neither of us wanted to navigate those woods in the dark, especially with whatever that was out there. We built the fire up high, kept our weapons close, and tried to convince ourselves we were just spooking each other. Around midnight, it started. Low moaning sounds from across the pond. Occasional howls that seemed to be answered by similar calls from different directions. The most disturbing part was the rocks and branches being thrown toward our camp from the darkness. Not falling naturally, being hurled with force. They'd splash into the pond or thud against the ground nearby. We never saw what was throwing them. "They're trying to scare us off," Cameron whispered. The "they" didn't go unnoticed by either of us. We didn't sleep. When dawn finally broke, we searched the area thoroughly. No tracks, no hair, no physical evidence of anything unusual. Just those same high scratches on trees and broken branches where something had moved through. I kept going back to that area over the years. Not to that exact spot, I'm not that foolish, but to the general region. Every time I felt watched. Not the vague sensation of being observed that's common in the wilderness. This was intense, deliberate. I'd be hiking and suddenly feel a pressure, like eyes boring into me from every direction. There's one ravine in particular that triggered an immediate sense of threat whenever I entered it. Hundreds of feet deep, with steep sides covered in dense vegetation. The bottom is perpetually in shadow, even at midday. The locals don't go there if they can help it. That ravine connects to others, forming a network of deep, shadowed hollows that extend through vast stretches of wilderness between Montana and Idaho. These connected ravines are so dense with vegetation that theoretically something could travel between states without ever stepping into direct sunlight. I moved to Colorado 2 years ago for work, but I still keep in touch with friends in Montana. They tell me people still report those eerie wolf-like howls and unexplained screaming from the woods. One Forest Service worker quit after 20 years because of what he called encounters in those ravines. What gets me is the intelligence behind it all. Whatever was out there wasn't just reacting instinctively. The wood knocking had patterns. The thrown objects seemed calculated. The territorial warnings were clear communication. Stay away. I've researched every known animal species in the region. Nothing matches what I experienced. I've spoken with wildlife biologists who dismiss it as misidentification or imagination. But they weren't there. They didn't feel that primal fear when those growls emerged from the darkness. The worst part is the uncertainty. In all my years of hunting, I've tracked and identified countless animals by their signs and behaviors. But whatever inhabits those deep ravines and dense forests leaves almost no trace. Just those impossibly high tree scratches and that distinctive foul odor. I'm not claiming to know what's out there. I'm not putting a name to it. All I know is that there's something in those Montana woodlands that doesn't fit any conventional explanation. Something that moves fast, stays hidden, communicates in patterns, and definitely doesn't want humans encroaching on its territory. Sometimes I still jolt awake around 2 in the morning, thinking I've heard that distinctive howl outside my window, even though I'm hundreds of miles away now. And I wonder, if I had ventured deeper into that ravine or stayed at that pond after dark, would I have finally seen what was making those sounds? And more importantly, would I have lived to tell about it? Story 8. I've always been the guy who rolls his eyes at ghost stories and Bigfoot sightings. I'm practical, logical, and I work with my hands for a living. I'm a construction foreman at a site about 40 miles from my house, which means early mornings and long, dark drives through some pretty remote areas. That's my routine, and I'm fine with it, or at least I was until 3 weeks ago. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because I was especially tired that morning. We'd been pushing to finish a big commercial project, and I'd been staying late all week. My alarm went off at 4:30, and I dragged myself out of bed, made coffee, and was on the road by 5. The route I take is mostly 2-lane back roads that wind through dense forest. It cuts about 15 minutes off my commute compared to the highway, plus I avoid all the traffic. At that hour, it's rare to see another car. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and whatever's on the radio. It was that weird time before sunrise, when there's just enough light to see the outline of the trees against the sky, but everything else is still pretty dark. I had my high beams on, cutting through the early morning fog that was hanging low over the pavement. I'd gone about 20 miles when my headlights caught something up ahead. At first, I just saw a dark shape on the road maybe 100 yards in front of me. Nothing unusual about that. We get deer, raccoons, and the occasional black bear in these parts. I eased off the gas a bit, which is just second nature when you drive these roads regularly. You don't want to hit wildlife, and I've had some close calls with deer before. As I got closer, I initially thought it was a bear. The shape was dark and low to the ground, and at this time of year, bears are common. They come down looking for food before winter sets in. I've seen them plenty of times, usually just lumbering across the road and disappearing into the trees. But something wasn't quite right about this one. I sped up a little, partly to get a better look and partly to encourage whatever it was to move off the road. That's when it started running, not across the road like you'd expect, but straight ahead in the same direction I was traveling. And that's when I realized this was definitely not a bear. The thing was running upright, on two legs. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it's just some guy out for an early morning jog. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't right. For one thing, it was completely unclothed. And as my headlights fully illuminated it, I could see it was covered in dark fur or hair. I slowed the truck down, but kept following at a distance of maybe 50 feet. I wasn't scared yet, more confused and curious. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, was moving with this fluid, controlled motion that was almost graceful. That sounds weird, but it's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like a bear trying to stand up. This thing was built to move on two legs. As I watched, I noticed two lighter patches in its dark fur. One across its upper back, maybe 3 or 4 inches wide, and another similar band across its rear end. The contrast was clear even in the dim light. The rest of it was uniformly dark, not black exactly, but a deep brown. It ran ahead of my truck for about 100 feet, and I just followed, almost in a trance. My headlights were locked on it the whole time. Then, without any hesitation or pause, it veered sharply to the left. It dropped down into the roadside ditch, climbed up the embankment on the other side, and disappeared into the brush. The whole movement was so smooth, so efficient. It never broke stride or seemed uncertain about its footing, despite the fact that the embankment was steep and covered with rocks and undergrowth. It never looked back at me, never acknowledged my presence at all. It was just gone. I pulled over and sat there for a few minutes trying to process what I'd just seen. The rational part of my brain was working overtime to come up with explanations. A person in a costume, at 5 in the morning on a deserted forest road, a large animal I'd somehow misidentified. But I know what bears look like when they stand and try to walk. This wasn't that. What struck me most was how easily it navigated in the low light. The ditch it jumped into was at least 4 feet deep, and the embankment on the other side was steep, maybe a 30-degree slope. I would have needed a flashlight to climb that safely at that hour, and I probably would have slipped or stumbled. This thing moved like it could see perfectly, like the terrain was no obstacle at all. And the way it ran, it wasn't a human gait. The proportions were off. Its legs seemed longer, and there was something about the way its arms swung that wasn't normal. Not wildly different, just not human. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes before I finally put the truck back in drive and continued to work. The whole day, I couldn't focus. My crew probably thought I was coming down with something because I kept zoning out. I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail, trying to convince myself I had a logical explanation. That night, I broke down and did something I never thought I would. I started researching Bigfoot sightings in my area. I've always laughed at that stuff, always. I'm the guy who makes jokes when those shows come on TV. But I found myself scrolling through websites, reading accounts, looking at blurry photos and wondering. Some of the descriptions matched what I saw. The height, I'd guess it was about 7 feet tall. The fur, the way it moved. But I didn't see anything about the light-colored bands I noticed. That detail has been bothering me the most because it was so distinctive. I drove the same route the next morning and every workday since. Part of me has been hoping to see it again, to confirm I wasn't just tired and seeing things. Another part of me has been dreading exactly that. I found myself driving slower through that stretch of road, eyes scanning the trees, heart rate picking up. I haven't told anyone about this. Not my wife, not my friends, not my co-workers. What would I say? Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot on my way to work. They'd never let me live it down, but keeping it to myself has been driving me crazy, which is why I'm writing this now. The thing that keeps nagging at me is how unafraid it seemed. It wasn't running from me in panic, it was just traveling, and when it decided to leave the road, it did so with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I was the one who didn't belong there, not it. I keep a flashlight in my truck now, and I've started leaving earlier so I can drive slower through that area. I've also bought a dash cam, though I know the chances of seeing it again are probably slim to none. But if I do, I want proof. I need proof. Not for anyone else, but for myself. The strangest part of all this is how it's changed me. I find myself looking at the forests differently now when I drive past. I wonder what else might be out there that we don't know about or understand. I've started noticing details I never paid attention to before: game trails leading into the woods, unusual breaks in the underbrush, odd sounds at night. When you see something you can't explain, something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world, it changes you. It's like someone shifted everything slightly to the left, and now nothing quite lines up the way it used to. I've lived in these parts my whole life. I've hunted these woods since I was a teenager. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. And that thing, whatever it was, didn't belong. Or maybe it does, and we're the ones who don't know the full story. I still consider myself a skeptic about most things. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens or psychic powers, but I can't explain what I saw that morning. I can't file it away as a bear or a deer or a guy in a costume. It moved too naturally, too purposefully. It navigated difficult terrain in near darkness with an ease that no human could match. I don't know what I saw on that road, but I know what I saw wasn't human. And after all these years of thinking Bigfoot was just a legend, a story people tell around campfires, I'm not so sure anymore. Whatever it was real. It was there. And sometimes when I'm driving home late and the forests are dark on either side of the road, I can't shake the feeling that it's out there, watching me pass by. Story 9. I've been hesitating to share this for almost 30 years now. Even typing this out makes my hands shake a little. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, sometimes I wish I didn't believe it myself. But I know what I saw that morning in '93, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I grew up in Billings, Montana, and spent most of my life exploring the outdoors. Fishing, hunting, camping, you name it. The wilderness was like a second home to me. I knew every trail, pond, and river within 50 miles of town like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Riverfront Park was a regular spot for me. It had this decent-sized pond just south of town, and I'd been fishing there since I was a teenager. The locals had these stories about the wooded area around the park, warnings about not going there alone, especially near dusk or dawn. You know how small towns are with their superstitions. I always laughed it off. After all, I'd been there hundreds of times without seeing anything stranger than a moose or the occasional black bear. It was early April, 1993. I remember because the ice had just melted off the pond, and I was itching to try out a new spinning reel I'd gotten for my birthday. I woke up while it was still dark, packed my gear, and drove out to the park, arriving just as the sun was coming up around 7 in the morning. The air was crisp, cold enough that I could see my breath, but not uncomfortable with my jacket on. There was that earthy spring smell in the air, you know, when everything's starting to wake up after winter. The parking lot was empty. No surprise there. It was a Wednesday morning, and most people were either still sleeping or heading to work. I walked down the trail to the pond, crossed over the small wooden bridge, and made my way to my favorite spot on the north side. There's a line of pine trees there that provides some shelter from the wind, and I've always had good luck catching trout in that area. I set up my folding chair, organized my tackle box, and baited my hook. The pond was completely still, reflecting the trees and early morning sky like a mirror. Perfect fishing conditions. For about 30 minutes, everything was normal. I caught a small rainbow trout, released it, and was just enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were birds waking up and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. That's when things changed. I heard splashing from across the pond. Not the small splash of a fish, but something bigger, like someone wading into the water. My first thought was that another fisherman had arrived, but I hadn't heard a car or footsteps on the trail. I looked up expecting to see someone in waders. What I saw instead froze the blood in my veins. On the opposite shore, maybe 75 feet away, something massive was standing up in the water. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was covered in thick, auburn-colored hair, not fur like a bear, but longer, more like human hair, but coarser. As it fully stood up, I realized how tall it was. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over any human I'd ever seen. It stepped out of the water onto the shore, water cascading off its body. That's when I got a clear look at it. The face was flat, almost human-like, but wrong. The proportions were off. Its eyes were deep set under a prominent brow, and its head had this strange conical shape at the top. Its shoulders were impossibly broad. I later estimated about 4 feet across. The arms hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My fishing rod slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the ground, but I barely noticed. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. It knew I was watching it. For about 15 seconds, though it felt like hours, we just stared at each other. I've never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in my entire life. It wasn't just fear, it was this primal understanding that I was in the presence of something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. Finally, it turned away and walked into the woods. Not on all fours like a bear, but upright, on 2 legs. As it moved through the tree line, I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed. Whatever this thing was, it was heavy and powerful. I sat there for maybe another minute, completely frozen. Then survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed my stuff, not even bothering to pack everything properly. My tackle box was half open, lures and hooks spilling out as I stumbled back toward the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified that the creature might be following me. When I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out. That's when I noticed another vehicle had arrived, an old blue Ford pickup. A man was standing beside it, looking toward the pond with binoculars. When he saw me rushing up, white as a sheet, he lowered them. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he asked. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. I nodded, unable to form words. "Not my first time," he said quietly. "Been seeing it around here since '86. Nobody believes me." He looked at me with a sad kind of sympathy. "Nobody's gonna believe you either." I managed to ask him what he thought it was. "Some call it Sasquatch. Others have different names. Don't matter what you call it. It's real, and it's been here longer than us." He got into his truck and started the engine. Before driving off, he rolled down his window. "I wouldn't come back here alone if I were you." I sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe some guy in a costume playing a prank. But I knew better. No bear moves like that. No costume is that realistic. And the eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes every time I closed mine. The next morning, I called my brother and my friend Mike, who was 6'7", the tallest guy I knew. I needed to go back. I needed to confirm what I'd seen, to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. We returned to the pond around noon. I was reluctant to go earlier, afraid we might encounter the creature again. I showed them exactly where I'd been sitting and where the thing had emerged from the water. Mike stood on a fallen log on the opposite shore, right where I'd seen the creature, even with his arms stretched above his head. Standing on a stump that raised him almost a foot, he wasn't close to the height of what I'd seen. We estimated the creature had been at least 9 feet tall. We found footprints in the mud by the shore, Massive impressions that made Mike's size 13 boots look tiny in comparison. The tracks led into the woods, but disappeared in the drier ground and pine needles. We also discovered broken branches high up in the trees, far higher than any human could reach. My brother, who'd always been the skeptic in the family, was unusually quiet as we measured and examined everything. When we got back to the car, he finally spoke. "I've spent my whole life in these woods," he said. "I've never believed in any of this Bigfoot nonsense, but whatever made those tracks isn't anything I recognize." Mike nodded in agreement. "No bear I've ever seen could make those footprints or break branches that high up." That night, the three of us sat on my porch drinking beers, trying to make sense of it all. None of us wanted to say the word Sasquatch out loud. It seemed ridiculous, like admitting we believed in fairy tales. But we all knew what we'd seen. In the weeks that followed, I did some research. I found reports of similar sightings in the area going back decades. Most people kept quiet about their experiences, afraid of being ridiculed. But once I started asking around, I discovered I wasn't alone. A forest ranger admitted off the record that there had been unexplained incidents in the woods around Billings for years. A local hunter showed me a plaster cast of a footprint he'd found in 1987 that matched what we'd seen. I still go fishing, I still hike and camp, but I never go alone anymore, and I never stay out after dark. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I get the feeling I'm being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I hear branches cracking in the distance. That day in 1993 changed me. It showed me that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I can't explain what I saw. I can't prove it to anyone who wasn't there. All I know is that the wilderness I thought I knew so well is home to something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've never seen it again. Part of me hopes I never will, but another part of me knows that it's still out there, watching from the trees, crossing paths with hikers and campers who have no idea how close they are to something that would shatter their understanding of the natural world. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I've heard those heavy footsteps outside my window. And in those moments I remember those intelligent eyes staring into mine across the still water of the pond. And I know that whatever I saw that day, it saw me too. Story 10. I've been sitting on this for almost 23 years now, going back and forth about whether I should share it or not. But after what happened last week, I can't keep it to myself anymore. I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar, especially anyone from Portage County, Ohio. We moved to Freedom Township back in 2000. My parents wanted to get away from the suburbs, and they found this perfect little farmhouse on 5 acres, with woods in the back and a small creek running through the property. I was 16 then, and at first I hated being so far from civilization. No neighbors within shouting distance, spotty cell service, and the kind of darkness at night that swallows you whole. But I got used to it. We all did. The first winter was when we noticed something wasn't quite right. It was January, the ground covered in about 8 inches of snow. I was in the kitchen helping my mom with dinner when we heard it, this weird rhythmic whooping sound coming from the woods. Not like an owl or coyotes. This was different. It sounded almost intentional, like whoop, 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 whoop. Loud and clear, even through the closed windows. Mom and I just looked at each other. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Dad came in from the living room. "You heard it too." We stood there, just listening, and it happened again. The sound carried through the frigid air, seeming to bounce between the trees. Our 2 German shepherds, Duke and Max, who usually bark at everything, were completely silent. They were standing at the back door, ears perked up, bodies rigid. That's when I started to get genuinely scared. Those dogs would bark at leaves blowing across the yard, but whatever was making that sound had them completely still. "Probably just some kids messing around," Dad said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. There were no other houses for at least half a mile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept waiting to hear that sound again, but it didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. But then it happened again and again, always at dusk, always in winter. For 3 years, we heard those whooping calls, and we started to dread the sun going down in January and February. The winter of 2004 was when things escalated. It was a Saturday night in February, unusually warm for that time of year. The snow had melted a bit during the day, making everything slushy and wet. I was in college by then, but home for the weekend. We were watching a movie when we heard it. Not the whooping this time, but a scream. A long, drawn-out wail that started low and rose to a pitch that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was coming from the direction of the creek. "What the hell was that?" my dad said, muting the TV. The scream came again, louder this time. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was emotional, like something in pain or angry. The dogs started whimpering and pacing by the back door. Not barking, whimpering. I'd never seen them so agitated. "I'm going to check it out," Dad said, reaching for his coat. "No!" Mum grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there!" Another scream ripped through the night, and this time it sounded like it was moving. Like whatever was making that sound was traveling above the tree canopy, then below it, then above again. I can't explain how something could do that, but that's what it sounded like. We turned off all the lights and just sat there in the dark, listening. The screams continued for almost an hour, sometimes sounding like they were right at the edge of our yard, sometimes farther away. The dogs wouldn't stop whining, and at one point Max actually peed on the floor, something he'd never done before. None of us slept that night. We kept the dogs inside, all the doors locked, and took turns watching out the windows. Nothing came out of the woods, at least nothing we could see. The next morning, Dad and I decided to check the barn. We kept some old farm equipment there, nothing valuable, but Dad wanted to make sure everything was secure. The ground was muddy from the melted snow, making squelching sounds under our boots. That's when we saw it, a single footprint in the soft earth near the barn door. Not a human footprint, not an animal print either, at least not like any I recognized. It was massive, easily 17 inches long, with what looked like 5 toes, splayed and deformed looking. The impression was deep, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. Dad and I just stared at it. Neither of us said anything for a long time. "Could be a bear," he finally suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Bears don't have feet like that," I said, "and they're hibernating right now." We took pictures of it with Dad's old film camera. I wish I still had those photos, but they were lost in a basement flood years later. We spent the rest of the day checking the property for more prints or any sign of what might have been out there, but we found nothing. That night we heard more wailing from the woods, not as close as before, but still distinct. It sounded distressed, almost emotional in a way that animals just aren't. The timbre of it changed as it called, like it was expressing different feelings through sound. I can't explain it properly, but it wasn't just an animal noise. It felt like communication. For the next week, we kept the dogs inside after dark. Dad started carrying his shotgun when he went out to do chores around dusk. Mum wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That we heard weird noises and found a strange footprint? We'd sound crazy. The rest of that winter passed without incident, and by spring, we'd almost convinced ourselves it was nothing. Almost. Over the next few years, we'd occasionally hear those whooping calls again, always in winter, always at dusk. Sometimes we'd find broken branches high up in the trees, way too high for a person to reach. Once, all the bird feeders in our yard were torn down overnight, bent and twisted like they'd been crushed in someone's hand. We started noticing other things too. The feeling of being watched when we were outside, especially near the tree line. Sometimes I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, something large moving between the trees. But when I'd turn to look directly, there would be nothing there. In 2008, I was browsing YouTube and stumbled across a video titled "Bigfoot Vocalizations in Pennsylvania." I clicked on it out of curiosity, not expecting anything. My blood ran cold as the audio played. The whooping sounds in the video were identical to what we'd been hearing for years. Exactly the same pattern, the same timbre, the same everything. I played it for my parents, and Mom started crying. Dad just sat there, his face pale. We started researching, learning that Portage County had numerous Bigfoot sightings over the years. People reported strange calls, massive footprints, and glimpses of large, hairy figures in the woods, all things we'd experienced ourselves. Last week, I was back at my parents' place, helping them prepare for their move. They're finally selling the house. Too much upkeep for them now that they're older. I was in the barn, sorting through old boxes, when I heard something moving around outside. It was just after sunset, that in-between time when it's not quite dark yet. I stepped to the barn door and froze. Standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by a large oak tree, was something. Something massive. It was hard to make out in the fading light, but it looked like it was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur. Its outline was distinctly human-like, but wrong somehow. Proportions all off, shoulders too wide, arms too long. For a moment, it just stood there, and I swear it was looking right at me. Then it made that sound, that same whooping call we'd been hearing for over 2 decades. Not from somewhere deep in the forest, but right there, 20 yards away from me. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at this thing as it stared back at me. Then our eyes met. At least I think they did. And something passed between us. Not a threat, not fear, but some kind of recognition. Like it knew me, had been watching our family all these years. It raised one massive hand, not in a wave exactly, but some kind of acknowledgement. Then it turned and moved back into the forest, disappearing so quickly and quietly it seemed impossible for something so large. I ran back to the house and told my parents what I'd seen. We sat up all night listening, but there were no more calls, no more glimpses of whatever lives in our woods. I don't know what to make of all this. I don't know if I believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever people call these things. What I do know is that something has been sharing this land with my family for 23 years, something that isn't supposed to exist. My parents are moving next month. Part of me wonders if it knows, if that's why it finally showed itself to me, like it was saying goodbye in the only way it could. I still don't have any real answers. All I have is this story and the certainty that whatever lives in those woods, it's been watching us far longer than we've been watching it. Story 11. I've never shared this story online before. It's hard to even type it out now, almost 23 years later. My hands are shaking just thinking about it. For those of you who don't believe in Sasquatch, I used to be one of you. I really did. Growing up in Boulder, Colorado, I'd roll my eyes whenever tourists would talk about Bigfoot country, or when the local paper would run those ridiculous stories about supposed sightings in the mountains. It was all just folklore to me, stories to tell around campfires, nothing more. That changed one night back in 2000. I was at Murphy's, this little dive bar just outside town where the locals hang out. It's nothing fancy, just wood paneling, cheap beer, and regulars who've been sitting on the same bar stools since the 80s. My friends and I would go there after hiking trips because they had dollar PBRs on Thursdays and we were fresh out of college, so cheap beer was our religion. This particular night, a bunch of guys who worked for the Forest Service were there, and somehow the conversation turned to Sasquatch sightings in the area. I remember laughing and making some smart-ass comment about how conveniently no one ever had clear photos. That's when I noticed this old guy at the end of the bar staring at me. Not in a creepy way, but with this look that just cut right through me, like he knew something I didn't. The bartender, Mike, noticed too and said, "Nancy, you haven't met Chigger yet, have you?" The old man raised his glass with his left hand, and that's when I realized he only had one arm. His right sleeve was pinned up just below the elbow. "Chigger Phelps," Mike continued, "spent 40 years logging these mountains. If you want to know what's really out there, he's the one to ask." I felt embarrassed for being so dismissive, especially in front of someone who'd clearly lived a harder life than I had. So I brought my beer over and introduced myself properly. Chigger was probably in his 70s, with this weathered face and eyes that looked like they'd seen things most people couldn't handle. He didn't smile when I sat down. "You think it's all bullshit, huh?" he asked, his voice raspy from what I assumed were decades of cigarettes. "I just think people see what they want to see," I said, trying to sound less like a jerk. "Bears standing up, shadows in the trees. You know how it is." He took a long drink, set down his glass and said, "Let me tell you something about your gentle forest giants." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Then he tapped his pinned-up sleeve with his good hand. This wasn't a logging accident. By now my friends had come over too, probably hoping for a good ghost story. What we got was something else entirely. Chigger told us he'd been working with a crew back in '77, building what would eventually become one of the first big ski lodges outside of Eldora. They were clearing timber on this remote mountainside, living in a temporary camp with about 15 guys. It was early fall, and they were pushing to finish before the heavy snows came. "We started noticing food going missing," he said, "not just a little, whole coolers emptied overnight. First we blamed each other, then we thought it might be bears, so we hung everything up high. Still kept happening." They set up watches, but whatever was raiding their supplies was smart enough to wait until the watchman dozed off or went to take a leak. Then one night, they heard a crash from the supply tent. 6 of them ran over with flashlights and caught what Chigger called a monkey monster trying to drag away a box of canned goods. "It wasn't full grown," he explained, swirling the whiskey Mike had brought him. "Maybe 5 feet tall, covered in this reddish-brown hair, face like, not quite human, not quite ape. It took all 6 of us to hold it down, and it was screaming the whole time, not like an animal, more like a kid. A really strong, really angry kid. They managed to tie it up with some nylon rope they used for securing timber loads. Then they dragged it to a tree near camp. Nobody knew what to do next. Their foreman had gone into town for supplies and wouldn't be back until morning. They had no radio. This was '77, remember? And the nearest phone was 20 miles away. Bobby Calhoun, he was our crew leader. He said we should move it somewhere more secure for the night, then the foreman could call whoever you call when you find a... Whatever it was, Chigger continued. We had this old supply shed we weren't using anymore. Solid wood, 1 door, no windows. So we moved it in there. The creature had calmed down by then, just watching them with these intelligent eyes that made some of the men so uncomfortable they couldn't look directly at it. They secured the door by wedging a log at an angle between the ground and the handle, an old logger's trick that makes it nearly impossible to push open from inside. They decided to keep watch in shifts through the night. Chigger took the midnight to 2 a.m. shift. He described sitting on a stump about 15 feet from the shed, rifle across his lap, just listening to the night sounds. He'd been out there about an hour when the forest went completely silent. Not a cricket, not an owl, nothing, he said. Just dead silence. That's when you know something's wrong in the woods. He stood up, rifle ready, scanning the trees around camp. Nothing. Then he heard a soft sound behind the shed, like something large carefully placing each foot. He started to circle around to check, keeping his distance. I got to the corner of the shed, and it was just there. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Standing not 5 feet away. I didn't hear it coming, no warning, just suddenly there. The adult Sasquatch was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders wider than a doorframe. Its arms hung down past its knees. Chigga said he froze, unable to even raise his rifle. The creature looked at him, then at the shed door with the log bracing it shut. "It knew," he said. "It understood exactly what we'd done." In one swift motion, it slapped the log away from the door. The piece of timber, which had taken 2 men to position, flew 20 feet like it was nothing. Then it turned back to Chigga. "I finally got my shit together and raised my rifle, but I never got to fire," he continued. "It grabbed my right arm so fast I didn't see it move, just had my wrist in its hand. And then..." He paused, taking another drink. Everyone at the bar was silent now, even the guys who'd probably heard this story before. "It didn't just break my arm, it snapped it at the elbow, and then..." He made a twisting, pulling gesture with his good hand. "Tore it clean off, like you'd pull a drumstick off a turkey. No effort at all." I remember feeling sick at this point, not sure if I believed him, but unable to look away from that empty sleeve. Blood was spraying everywhere. It tossed my arm aside like trash, then grabbed me by the chest and threw me against the shed wall. Doctor later said the impact broke 4 ribs and punctured my lung. I blacked out. When Chigga woke up, he was in a hospital in Denver. The crew had found him at dawn, barely alive in a pool of blood. The shed door was open, both Sasquatch gone. The juvenile had somehow gotten loose from the ropes, or the adult had untied it. "The camp doctor saved my life," he said. "Tied off the arteries before I bled out, but they never found my arm. Searched the whole area, nothing. The logging company tried to cover it up, claiming it was a machinery accident. The foreman threatened to fire anyone who told the real story. Most of the crew quit anyway, too spooked to go back to that mountain. The lodge eventually got built, but by a different crew the next year." "You know what bothers me most?" Chigga said, leaning in close. "It could have killed me easily. Could have torn my head off like a bottle cap, but it didn't. It just took my arm, like a warning, like it was saying, 'This is the price for taking one of ours.'" He looked directly at me then, and I'll never forget his expression. "They're not gentle giants. They're not misunderstood forest people. They're predators who've learned to fear and avoid humans. But they're watching us, and they remember faces." One of my friends laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Come on, man. You expect us to believe that?" Chigga didn't get angry. He just rolled up his sleeve to show us the scars at the end of his stump. They didn't look like surgical scars. They looked jagged, torn, wrong. "Believe what you want," he said. "Just don't go looking for them. And if you're ever alone in the deep woods and everything goes quiet, run. Don't look back. Just run." We left soon after. My friends spent the drive home debating whether Chigga was crazy or if he'd made up the story to mess with tourists. But I kept thinking about his eyes when he told that story. There was real fear there. Not the kind you fake for a ghost story, but the kind that stays with you decades later. I've spent a lot of time in the Colorado wilderness in the 4 years since that night. I've hiked hundreds of miles of trails, camped in the most remote spots. I've never seen a Sasquatch, but sometimes when I'm deep in the backcountry and the forest goes silent, I find myself scanning the trees. And I think about what Chigga said, about them remembering faces. I don't laugh at Bigfoot stories anymore, and I never hike alone. To this day, I can't explain what happened to Chigga Phelps, but I believe he believed it. And that's enough to keep me looking over my shoulder whenever I'm in the woods. Sometimes I still see those eyes he described, intelligent, angry, calculating, in my dreams. And I wake up with my heart pounding, feeling like I'm being watched. Story 12. I've never told anyone outside my immediate family about what happened to me, but it's been over 6 years now, and I still wake up in cold sweats some nights. Maybe writing this all down will help me process it. I don't know. In January of 2017, I moved to a small town in West Virginia, right at the edge of the Appalachians. I'd gotten a decent job at a manufacturing plant there. and housing was dirt cheap compared to where I'd been living. Found this apartment complex that was basically the last buildings before miles of wilderness. The view was gorgeous. Rolling hills covered in trees as far as you could see. Perfect place for someone like me who loves the outdoors. The first few weeks were uneventful. Work, come home, watch TV, sleep. Typical stuff. But around the third week, I started hearing these sounds at night. I'd be sitting on my little balcony having a beer, and these howls would echo across the hills. Not like coyotes or wolves. Something different. Longer, more deliberate. They reminded me of those Ohio howl recordings I'd heard on some Cryptid podcast once. The creepy part wasn't just the howls themselves, but how they'd respond to each other. One hill would sound off, then another would answer from a different direction. Back and forth, sometimes for hours. My neighbor told me it was just coyotes, but I've heard coyotes before. This was something else entirely. By April, I'd settled into a routine and decided to start. Hiking in the mornings. I've always been an early riser, so I'd head out while it was still dark, around 5 a.m., and hit this old mining road that wound up into the hills. Nothing extreme, just a nice 4-mile loop to get some exercise before work. On my first hike, about half a mile in, I heard this weird bird-like whistle from somewhere in the trees. It was still dark, just the faintest hint of pre-dawn light, and I remember thinking it was strange to hear a bird call that loud so early. It was sharp, almost piercing, 2 quick notes, high then low. I didn't think much of it and actually whistled back, mimicking the sound as best I could. That was my first mistake. The whistle came again, closer this time. Then again from a different direction. I kept walking, my headlamp illuminating just enough of the path ahead. The whistling followed me, keeping pace through the timber. It wasn't random anymore. It was responding to my movements. I stopped. It stopped. I walked faster. It moved faster. Then I heard the first pebble hit the ground near my foot. Just a tiny rock, no bigger than a marble. I looked around, thinking maybe it had fallen from somewhere above. Then another one landed, this time deliberately thrown, so it skittered across the path in front of me. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" No answer. Just another sharp whistle, closer than before. More pebbles came, then slightly larger rocks. They weren't hitting me, just landing around me with increasing frequency. I started walking faster, my heart rate picking up. This had to be kids, right? Local teenagers messing with the city guy? "This isn't funny," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative rather than scared. "I can hear you moving around out there." The only response was another whistle, 2 notes, high then low, from somewhere off to my right. I kept moving forward, approaching a bend in the trail where it curved around a steep hillside. As I got closer to that curve, this overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, that something bad was waiting just around that bend. That's when the woods erupted with noise. Crashing sounds, heavy footsteps moving through underbrush, more rocks being thrown. But now, from multiple directions, it sounded like several people were moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me, but staying just out of sight in the darkness beyond my headlamp's beam. I froze, weighing my options. Running seemed like the worst idea. Whatever was out there knew these woods better than I did, and I had this gut feeling that running would trigger something worse, like predator and prey. If I ran, something would chase. So I turned around calmly and started walking back the way I came, constantly looking over my shoulder. The sounds followed, growing bolder. About 100 yards down the trail, I saw it, or something anyway. A dark shape leapt from the ridge above the trail, down onto the path about 50 yards behind me, then immediately crashed into the brush on the other side. I still don't know what I saw. It was just a silhouette in the dim light, but the movement was all wrong. Too fluid, too graceful for the steep, rocky terrain, and the distance it covered in that single bound. No person could jump like that. No deer or bear either. By the time I was approaching the edge of the woods near my apartment complex, the sounds behind me had intensified. Loud thumping like heavy footfalls, branches snapping, and now multiple sources of whistling, seemingly all around me. I couldn't maintain my calm anymore. I broke into a sprint for the final 100 feet, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. When I turned around, gasping for breath, nothing emerged from the tree line. Just the normal pre-dawn stillness, as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was just some weird local thing, maybe hunters using bird calls or kids playing pranks. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, I tried to resume normal life. I stopped hiking that particular trail, but still went out during daylight hours on more populated paths. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like after that morning, I was never truly alone anymore. Small things started happening. I'd step outside my apartment to smoke, and a pebble would land near my feet, thrown from the direction of the woods about 30 yards away. I'd shine my flashlight toward the trees and occasionally catch quick flashes of eye shine, reflected light from eyes watching me. But they were positioned too high up for any normal animal, unless bears in West Virginia regularly stand 7 feet tall at the edge of the woods. And the whistling. Always the whistling, 2 notes, high then low, sometimes when I'd be getting into my car for work in the early morning, sometimes right outside my bedroom window at night. My roommate thought I was losing it until one evening in late May. We were sitting on our small patio, having a couple beers, maybe 30 feet from where the forest began. The sun had just gone down, and we were talking about normal stuff, work, sports, whatever. Mid-conversation, the ground literally shook beneath us, like something massive had stomped just inside the tree line. We both froze, beer bottles halfway to our mouths. Then it came again, a heavy impact that vibrated through the concrete patio. "What the fuck was that?" my roommate whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it. A scream unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. It started like a woman's shriek, then morphed into something like a lion's roar, before ending in a sound that wasn't remotely human or animal. It echoed across the hills, so loud it hurt my ears. We both stood up immediately, ready to bolt for the door. But the second we moved, another scream tore through the night, closer this time. It was like whatever was making that sound was responding directly to our movement. We tried 3 times to make a break for the door. Each time, that ungodly scream would erupt from a different position along the tree line, as if something was pacing back and forth, watching us. It was toying with us, keeping us trapped outside. We ended up sitting there for hours, barely moving, barely breathing, until the first hint of dawn. Only then did we feel safe enough to hurry inside. My roommate packed his bags that morning and went to stay with his parents. I don't blame him. I stuck it out another 2 weeks before breaking my lease and getting the hell out of there in June. I left half my furniture behind and didn't even care about losing my security deposit. Some things are worth paying to escape from. The last night I spent in that apartment, I heard the whistling right outside my bedroom window. 2 notes, high then low, repeated 3 times. Then something scraped against the glass. Not like a branch in the wind, but deliberate, like fingers or claws, dragging slowly across the surface. I kept the blinds closed and didn't look. Some primal part of me knew that whatever was out there, I didn't want to see its face. I live in Cincinnati now. Haven't gone hiking since. People ask me why I sold all my camping gear and outdoor equipment, and I just make up excuses about not having time anymore. The truth is, I'll never set foot in those kinds of woods again without being properly armed. And even then, I'm not sure it would make a difference. Whatever was in those West Virginia hills, it wasn't afraid of humans. It was studying us, learning our patterns, testing our reactions. Sometimes I still hear whistling in my dreams, 2 notes high then low, and I wake up wondering if it followed me here or if it's still back there in those hills, waiting for someone else to whistle back. Story 13. I've been an outdoorsman all my life. Grew up hunting, fishing, and camping in the mountains of Utah. My dad taught me to track deer when I was 8, and I've spent more nights under the stars than I can count. I'm not saying this to brag, just so you understand that I know what I'm looking at when I'm out there. I know what a bear looks like at 300 yards. I know how an elk moves through brush. I can tell the difference between a coyote and a wolf from a distance. What I saw in December 2018 wasn't any of those things. I own a small cabin outside Logan Canyon. Nothing fancy, just a place to use as a base during hunting season and occasionally on weekends. That year, I'd gotten an elk during the late season hunt, a decent 5-point bull, and I was spending a few days at the cabin to process the meat before heading back to my regular job in Salt Lake. It was December 5th, a Wednesday. I remember because I'd taken the whole week off work. The weather had been cold but clear, typical early December stuff, with about 8 inches of snow on the ground. That morning I realized I needed more butcher paper and a few other supplies, so around 2 in the afternoon I drove into town. The trip was uneventful. Picked up what I needed, grabbed some coffee, and headed back toward the cabin around 3:30. The sun was already getting low, you know how winter days are, casting these long shadows across the canyon. Temperature was dropping too, probably high 20s by then. I was on Highway 89 going eastbound, just past the turnoff for Tony Grove, when it happened. I wasn't even really thinking about anything, just driving and scanning the hillsides like I always do. Force of habit when you're a hunter. You're always looking for movement, for animals. I was doing about 55, maybe 60 more feet. To my right, there was this ridge running parallel to the highway. It was maybe 200 yards away, sloping upward from the road. The area was partly open with patches of fir trees and these bare, quaking aspens scattered around. Fresh snow everywhere. It's a spot where I've seen elk and mule deer plenty of times before. That's what I initially thought I was seeing, an elk or maybe a moose. Just a quick glimpse of something dark moving along the edge of the tree line. But something about the movement caught my attention. It wasn't right. I looked more carefully while trying to keep my truck on the road. The figure was moving on 2 legs, not 4. My first thought was, oh, must be another hunter. But within a second, I knew that wasn't it either. This thing was tall. I'm not great at judging distances, but comparing it to the trees nearby, it had to be at least 6.5 feet, maybe taller, and its proportions were wrong, just wrong for a human. I looked away briefly to check the road, then looked back. It was still there, moving steadily along the ridge. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging almost to its knees. The head seemed to jut forward a bit, giving it this hunched look. But it wasn't bent over. It was moving smoothly, purposefully, covering ground fast with this weird, even gait. Its arms barely swung as it moved. I kept glancing between the road and this creature for maybe 10 seconds total. Long enough to know for certain I wasn't looking at a bear standing up, or a moose, or a person in a coat. The way it moved was fluid, but unnatural at the same time. Like nothing I've ever seen in 20+ years of being in those mountains. The really strange thing, it didn't seem scared or startled by my truck. It wasn't running away, it was just moving, heading deeper into the mountains with this determined stride. And here's the part that still bothers me. I didn't stop, I didn't even slow down. It was like my brain just accepted what I was seeing without fully processing it. I watched it until a curve in the road took it out of view, and I just kept driving. Got back to my cabin, unloaded my supplies, and started working on the elk meat like nothing had happened. It wasn't until I was sitting there that evening, drinking a beer by the wood stove, that it really hit me. What the hell did I just see? I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways. Maybe it was just a tall hunter in dark clothes, but the proportions were all wrong. Those arms were too long, the stride too smooth for someone trudging through snow. Could it have been a bear? No way. I've seen plenty of black bears on their hind legs. They don't move like that, and they certainly don't walk that way for extended periods. Was it a moose? Elk? No. Wrong shape entirely, and they don't walk on 2 legs. A guy in a costume, out there, miles from any trailhead in December, and moving that efficiently through snow. I didn't take any pictures, didn't have my phone ready, and honestly, it didn't even occur to me in the moment. Like I said, there was this weird sense of calm while I was actually seeing it. It was only later that the wrongness of it all sank in. I told a couple of hunting buddies about it a few days later. One of them laughed it off, suggested I'd been in the woods too long. The other got real quiet and said his uncle had seen something similar near Hardware Ranch about 15 years ago. We didn't talk about it much after that. For a while, I was obsessed with figuring out what I saw. I even went back to that same stretch of highway a few times, hoping I might see it again. Never did. I looked online for similar sightings in the area, but found mostly just typical Bigfoot stories that didn't really match what I'd seen. This wasn't some hairy ape man. It was something else, thinner, more deliberate in its movements. The thing that sticks with me most is how it seemed to belong there. It wasn't crashing through the woods or acting out of place. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going, like it traveled that ridge all the time. Like it was at home. I've spent my whole life in those mountains. I thought I knew everything that lived there. Now I'm not so sure. For months afterward, I found myself constantly scanning the tree lines whenever I was driving or hiking. I started carrying a better camera with a zoom lens in my truck. I even set up a trail cam near my cabin, though it never caught anything unusual. When I went back to the cabin for the spring turkey season that next April, I felt different about the place. Not scared exactly, but aware, like I was being watched. One night I could have sworn I heard bipedal footsteps outside, but when I checked in the morning, there were no tracks in the mud that I could find. I still hunt there, still spend weekends at the cabin. But I'm more cautious now. I pay more attention to sounds in the night. Sometimes when I'm sitting on the porch at dusk, I get this feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck, like something is standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching me from the shadows. What bothers me most is that I never felt threatened by what I saw. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't charge my vehicle or even seem to care that I was there. It was just existing, going about its business. And somehow that's more unsettling than if it had been menacing, because it means this thing has probably been there all along, moving through those mountains, maybe watching us without us knowing. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what I saw that day. Was it something undiscovered? Some kind of animal science hasn't classified yet? Or was it something else? Something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what's supposed to exist? I don't have answers. Just the memory of those 10 seconds on the highway, watching something impossible move along that snowy ridge. And the knowledge that when I'm in those mountains now, I might not be at the top of the food chain like I always thought. Last fall, I was field dressing a deer about 2 miles from my cabin. It was getting dark, and I was hurrying to finish before I lost daylight completely. I kept hearing these cracks in the forest behind me. Branches breaking, but not in the random way they break when a deer or elk moves through. These were deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps. I didn't turn around, just kept working, my hands shaking a little as I finished gutting the deer. The whole time, I could feel eyes on my back. When I finally got the courage to look, there was nothing there. But on the hike back to my truck, I found a track in the mud. A single footprint, much larger than mine, with toes that seemed too long. I didn't take a picture, didn't measure it, just stared at it for a minute, then got the hell out of there. I still go to my cabin, still hunt those mountains, but I don't go as deep into the backcountry alone anymore. And I never stay out after dark if I can help it. Whatever I saw that December day changed something fundamental about how I see those woods. They're not just woods anymore. They're someone else's territory too. I just hope we can keep sharing it peacefully, because I'm not ready to give up my mountains, even if I now know I was never alone in them to begin with. Story 14. I've never publicly shared this before, but it's been almost 30 years and I still can't shake what happened that night in 1994. I was 17 then, a junior at Chattanooga Central High, and basketball was my whole life. That Friday night, we'd just won a home game against our rivals, and I was riding the high with my buddies Jason and Eric. It was around midnight when we decided to take the long way home. Jason was driving his dad's Chevy Impala, I was riding shotgun, and Eric was sprawled across the back seat, still hyped from the game. We were all sweaty, exhausted, but too wired to go straight home. Someone suggested Cedar Ridge Road, that winding back road that leads up to the old, abandoned Methodist church on the hill. Every teenager in Chattanooga knew about that place. It was where you took girls to make out, or where you'd hang out drinking beers on weekend nights. The radio was playing Pearl Jam or something, I don't remember exactly, but I remember Jason turning it down as we hit the bottom of the hill. It was pitch black out there, no streetlights, just the headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees made these weird shadows that danced across the road. We were laughing about Coach Bennett's face when Eric made that three-pointer in the final quarter. That's when everything changed. About halfway up the hill, Jason suddenly slowed down. The headlights caught something in the middle of the road. At first I thought it was a deer. We get them all the time out there. But then I realized it was too big for a deer. Whatever it was crouched down, like it was sitting on the pavement. "What the hell is that?" Jason muttered, slowing down even more. The three of us leaned forward, straining to see. As the headlights fully illuminated it, the thing stood up. God, I'll never forget how it unfolded itself. It wasn't like a person standing up. It was more fluid, like watching something that shouldn't be able to move that way. It rose to its full height, and I felt my stomach drop. This thing was tall, impossibly tall, like 7 or 8 feet at least. But it wasn't bulky. It was thin, lanky, with these arms that hung way too low. They reached past its knees, swinging loosely as it moved. The whole thing was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like long, shaggy hair that hung from its body. In the headlights, I could see it was dark brown or black, and it moved with the creature, swaying slightly. What happened next still gives me chills. This thing, whatever it was, crossed the entire road in 3 strides. 3. And these weren't normal steps. They were these powerful, deliberate movements that covered way more ground than any human could. Then, without breaking stride, it leaped over these roadside bushes that had to be at least 4 or 5 feet tall, just cleared them like they were nothing, and disappeared down the hill into the darkness. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds that I've replayed in my mind thousands of times since. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever. Jason had slowed the car to almost a complete stop, and we just sat there, the engine idling. I could hear Eric breathing heavily in the back seat. My own heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jason finally accelerated again, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We drove up the rest of the hill in complete silence. It wasn't until we reached the intersection at the top, where the road splits near the old church, that anyone spoke. "Did you guys see that?" Eric's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I saw," I said, but my voice was shaking. I turned to look at Jason, and that's when I realized how badly this had affected him. His face was pale, and he looked like he was fighting back tears. Jason was our team captain, 6'2", and built like a linebacker. Nothing scared him, but right then, he looked like a little kid. "That wasn't a person," he said. "That wasn't a bear. What the hell was that?" Eric leaned forward from the back seat. "It was sitting on the road. Why would it be sitting on the road?" That's when it clicked for me. "The pavement," I said. "It's been a warm day, but tonight got cold fast. The pavement would still be warm. It was sitting on the warm pavement." We sat at that intersection for maybe 5 minutes, just trying to process what we'd seen. Then Jason suddenly put the car in reverse. "We're going back," he said. "Are you crazy?" Eric practically shouted, but I nodded. "We need to know." Jason swung the car around and drove back down the hill, faster this time, his high beams on full. We scanned the roadside, looking for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing, just empty pavement and dark woods on either side. When we reached the spot where we'd seen it, Jason stopped the car. The road was empty. The bushes where it had jumped were still there, but there was no sign that anything had passed through them, at least nothing we could see from the car. "We should get out and look," I suggested, though every instinct was screaming at me to stay in the car. "No way," Eric said. "No way am I getting out here." Jason just shook his head and put the car back in drive. "Let's get out of here." We drove to a gas station about 15 minutes away and just sat in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights. It was like we needed to be somewhere bright and normal for a while. We talked about what we'd seen, trying to convince ourselves it was a bear or maybe some guy in a costume, but we all knew better. "It moved wrong," Eric kept saying. "People don't move like that." After about an hour, we decided to go back with flashlights. I know that sounds insane, but we were 17 and we needed to prove to ourselves that we weren't crazy. We called our friend Mike, who lived nearby, and he came to meet us with his older brother Tyler. They thought we were pulling a prank at first, but something in our faces must have convinced them. The 5 of us went back to Cedar Ridge Road around 2 in the morning. Tyler had brought a hunting rifle from his dad's collection, which made me feel both safer and more terrified at the same time. The fact that he thought we might need it meant he believed there was something out there worth shooting at. We parked at the same spot and got out, flashlights scanning the roadside. That's when we found the evidence that we hadn't imagined the whole thing. The bushes, the ones I'd seen the creature jump over, had broken branches on top. Something heavy had pushed through them. And on the other side, leading down the hill, we could see where the undergrowth had been disturbed, like something large had moved through it recently. Tyler crouched down and examined. "The ground." "These aren't deer tracks," he said quietly. "They're not bear tracks either." We didn't go any further into the woods. Even with 5 of us and a rifle, nobody suggested following whatever trail might be down there. We just documented what we could see and got the hell out of there. For weeks afterward, we were obsessed with figuring out what we'd seen. We went to the library and looked up local legends. We asked older people in town if they'd ever heard stories about something in the woods around Cedar Ridge. Most people laughed us off, but a few old-timers got real quiet when we described what we'd seen. One elderly man who worked at the gas station near my house told me that his grandfather used to talk about the tall ones that lived in the hills around Chattanooga. He said they'd been there long before the city was built, and they mostly kept to themselves unless someone ventured too far into their territory. I'd never believed in Bigfoot or any of that stuff before. I was a regular kid who cared about basketball, girls, and getting into a decent college. But after that night, I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. The image of that creature unfolding itself to its full height, those impossibly long arms, the way it moved with such unnatural speed and grace. It was burned into my memory. The thing that still haunts me the most is how easily it cleared those bushes. It wasn't just the height of the jump, but the effortlessness. This wasn't some person in a costume. This was something powerful, something that belonged in those woods in a way that we didn't. We went back to Cedar Ridge several more times in the weeks that followed, always in a group, always during daylight. We never saw the creature again, but I always had the feeling we were being watched from the trees. Eventually, we stopped going. Life moved on. Basketball season ended. We graduated the following year and went our separate ways. I haven't spoken to Jason or Eric in years now. Last I heard, Jason refuses to talk about that night at all. Eric moved out west somewhere. I stayed in Tennessee, but I never go hiking alone, and I avoid back roads at night. Some fears stay with you. Sometimes I try to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know how it moved. I know how it made me feel. That primal fear that comes from seeing something that shouldn't exist in your familiar world. I've never reported this officially or gone public with it until now. What would be the point? Without evidence, it's just another crazy story. But I know what I saw on Cedar Ridge Road that night in 1994. And whatever it was real. It was intelligent enough to be warming itself on the pavement. It was powerful enough to cross that road in 3 strides and clear those bushes like they were nothing. And it was aware enough to disappear completely when we came back looking for it. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some undiscovered species or something else entirely. All I know is that it changed how I see the world. The forests around Chattanooga don't feel the same anymore. When I drive past wooded areas at night, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if something's watching me from the darkness. Whatever I saw that night, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the wind is moving through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear something moving out there. Something with a stride too long to be human. Something that knows these hills better than we ever will. Story 15. I've been holding this in for over 20 years. I need to tell someone who might believe me, because my family doesn't like talking about it anymore, and I can't really blame them. This happened on Sunday, May 19th, 2002. We own a decent-sized property in rural Minnesota, about 40 acres with some woods, fields, and a ravine cutting through one section. Nothing fancy, but enough space for us to enjoy outdoor activities without bothering anyone. My husband and I bought it as an investment years ago, and we'd go there on weekends with our kids to ride dirt bikes, hike, and sometimes camp overnight. That Sunday started like any other. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, maybe mid-60s with some clouds. My husband Miguel was teaching our daughter Elena how to handle the smaller dirt bike while I was setting up our campsite near some hay bales at the edge of our property. Our son Carlos, who was 11 at the time, was helping me unpack our stuff. I remember I was laying out the sleeping bags in our tent when Carlos tugged on my sleeve. "Mom," he said, his voice sounding weird. "Look over there, by the hay bales." I glanced up casually, not thinking much of it. "What am I looking at, honey?" "There's someone sitting there." That's when I felt the first chill. We were in the middle of nowhere. Our nearest neighbor was over a mile away. There shouldn't be anyone on our property. I straightened up and squinted in the direction he was pointing, but my view was partially blocked by the stack of hay bales about 50 yards away. I didn't see anything at first, and I was about to tell Carlos it was probably just a shadow when something moved. Whatever it was had already stood up and was walking away from us, heading toward the dense trees and the ravine beyond. My stomach dropped instantly. Even from behind, even at that distance, I knew I wasn't looking at a person. This thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in reddish-brown hair, like rust-colored fur, but not uniform like a bear's coat. It moved on 2 legs with a strange, hunched posture, like it was carrying something heavy on its shoulders. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging at weird angles at its sides. The head sat directly on its shoulders, no real neck that I could see, and it was much larger than any human head should be. It didn't run away exactly. It walked deliberately, almost like it wasn't concerned about us seeing it. Like it knew it could disappear before we could do anything. Carlos was gripping my arm so hard it hurt. "Did you see its face, Mom?" he whispered. I shook my head, still frozen in place. "No, it was turned away." "I did," he said. "When it first stood up, it looked at me for a second." "What did it look like?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Its face was white, like really pale skin. No hair on its face, but the rest of it was hairy. It looked, I don't know, like an ape, but not really. Its eyes were dark." I called Miguel over, trying to keep my voice steady so I wouldn't alarm Elena. By the time he reached us, the creature was gone, disappeared into the tree line. Miguel didn't believe us at first. He thought Carlos was making up stories and that I'd gotten swept up in his imagination. But there was something in Carlos's face, a kind of stunned fear, that eventually convinced my husband to at least humor us. "Let's go check it out," Miguel said, grabbing a baseball bat we kept with our camping gear. I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to stay alone at the campsite with the kids. The four of us walked cautiously to where the creature had vanished. The tree line was about 100 yards from our camp, marking the beginning of a steep ravine that cut through our property. As we approached, Carlos pointed to the ground. "Look, footprints!" Sure enough, there were 3 or 4 very distinct impressions in the soft dirt. My heart nearly stopped. They were huge, larger than my husband's size 13 boots. They were clearly defined with 5 toes, similar to human footprints but much, much bigger and deeper. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Miguel crouched down, examining them. I could see his skepticism fading. "These are fresh," he said quietly. He looked up at the dense woods, then back at the prints. "What the hell made these?" We didn't venture further into the woods. Miguel insisted we return to camp and pack up, but I argued that we'd driven over 2 hours to get there, and the kids had been looking forward to riding the dirt bikes. After some discussion, we decided to stay, but remain vigilant and stick together. The rest of the afternoon was tense. Miguel took the kids riding in the open field, keeping them in sight at all times. I stayed at camp, constantly scanning the tree line for any movement. Nothing unusual happened for a few hours, and I started to relax a little. Around 4 o'clock, I decided to take a quick solo ride on my dirt bike. Miguel was helping the kids with something, and I thought a short ride might help clear my head. I headed in the opposite direction of where we'd seen the creature, sticking to the open areas of our property. I was about half a mile from camp when my bike suddenly stalled. I remember checking the fuel and finding it nearly full. As I was troubleshooting, standing alone in a small gully, I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. It was a scream, not human, not animal, something in between, high-pitched and guttural at the same time. It came from somewhere between a quarter and half-mile away, from the direction opposite our camp. I couldn't tell if it was a call or a warning or what, but it echoed across the property in a way that made me feel like I was being watched. I abandoned all attempts to fix the bike and just pushed it back to camp as fast as I could. When I got there, I tried to act normal, but Miguel could tell something was wrong. I told him about the scream, and he suggested we leave before dark. The kids protested. They wanted to roast marshmallows and sleep in the tent like we'd promised. After some debate, we decided to stay the night but keep a fire going all night, long. As dusk settled, we made dinner over the campfire, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. The kids seemed to have forgotten about the creature, but Miguel and I kept exchanging glances every time we heard a sound from the woods. Our nearest neighbor, the Johnsons, lived about 1.5 miles away. They had this big German shepherd named Rex that would sometimes bark at night, but we could rarely hear him from our property. But around 11 that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, we heard Rex barking. It was distant at first, but something was different. The barking was frantic, almost panicked. Miguel and I sat by the fire, listening. The barking seemed to be getting closer, moving in our direction. It wasn't steady. It would stop, then start again with renewed intensity, like Rex was chasing something. "Do you think the Johnsons let their dog out this late?" I whispered. Miguel shook his head. "They keep him in at night, and he wouldn't come this far on his own." The barking continued throughout the night, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Neither of us slept. Around 3:30 in the morning, the barking suddenly became vicious, unlike anything I'd ever heard from a dog. It sounded like Rex was about 100 yards from our camp, just beyond the tree line. He was in a complete frenzy, snarling and barking in a way that made me think he'd cornered something. Then abruptly, the barking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. A few seconds later, we heard something crashing through the trees, something big and fast. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps was unmistakable. Rex started barking again, clearly chasing whatever it was. The footsteps were unlike anything I'd ever heard. Too heavy for a deer, too fast for a bear. Whatever was running could cover ground at an incredible speed. Then we heard a blood-curdling yelp from Rex, and after that, nothing. Complete silence. Miguel grabbed the baseball bat and stood up. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'm going to check." "No," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't you dare leave us alone." We stayed by the fire, adding more wood to keep it blazing. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I was terrified of trying to navigate the dark country roads with whatever was out there. So we waited, jumping at every small sound, until dawn finally broke. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up and left. I remember Carlos looking back at the tree line as we drove away, his face pale. "Do you think it killed that dog?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to think. A few days later, my husband called the Johnsons to casually ask how they were doing. During the conversation, he mentioned hearing their dog barking that night. There was a pause on the line, and then Mr. Johnson said something that still gives me chills. "Rex disappeared that night. We found pieces of his collar by the ravine on your property, but we never found him. We've been back to the property many times since then. We couldn't just abandon our investment. But we never stay overnight anymore. We always leave before dusk, and we never let the kids go near the ravine alone. Sometimes when I'm there, I feel like I'm being watched. I'll catch movement at the edge of my vision or hear something that doesn't sound quite right. But I've never seen the creature again until last month. I was alone, checking on some fencing that had been damaged in a storm. As I was walking back to my car, I glanced toward the ravine and saw something move among the trees. Just for a second, I saw that same reddish-brown fur, that same massive frame, and then it was gone. I haven't told my family. My kids are grown now, and Carlos never talks about what happened. I think he's convinced himself it was a bear or some other animal. Maybe that's better, because I don't have an explanation for what I saw that day. I don't know what was on our property or what might still be there. All I know is that sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that same high-pitched scream echoing across our land. Story 16. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate, and honestly, I still question what I saw that night. But it's been eating at me, and I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar in the Big Cypress area. This happened last October when I was fly fishing alone in a pretty remote section of the Big Cypress National Preserve in southern Florida. I've been fishing those waters for nearly 15 years, so I know the area well. There's this particular stretch of slow-moving river that's perfect for bass and bream, especially in the evening when they're more active. That day, I arrived around 4 in the afternoon, planning to fish through sunset and a few hours into the night. The fishing had been decent lately, and I wanted to take advantage of the cooler weather. I parked my truck about a quarter-mile from my spot and hiked in with my gear, just my fly rod, tackle box, a large battery-powered lantern, and a small cooler with water and a sandwich. The spot I like is secluded, with cypress trees creating this natural alcove along the riverbank. The water there is relatively shallow near the edge, but drops off about 10 feet out. It's perfect for wading and casting. When I got there, everything was normal. No strange sounds, no odd feelings, just the usual chorus of frogs, insects, and occasional bird calls. I waded in and started fishing, catching a few small bass before sunset. As darkness fell, I set up my lantern on this twisted cypress root system that juts out from the bank. It created just enough light for me to see my gear and a small area around it. I also made this little pool by arranging some rocks near the water's edge, something I always do to keep my catch alive and fresh until I'm ready to leave. By around 9 o'clock, I had 4 decent-sized fish in my rock pool, 2 bass and 2 bream. I was pretty satisfied, but wanted to try a few more casts before calling it a night. I moved about 20 yards upstream, just at the edge of where my lantern light faded into darkness. The night was clear with a quarter moon, but under the cypress canopy, it was pretty dark beyond my light. I was casting toward the center of the river when I noticed my fly was gone, probably snagged on something underwater. I decided to head back to my gear to tie on a new one. As I waded back toward the lighted area, something felt different. It's hard to explain, but the normal night sounds seemed to have quieted down a bit. That's when I first noticed some movement near the cypress trees by the embankment. At first, I thought it might be a deer coming down for water, or maybe a wild hog. They're pretty common in the area. But when I got closer, I could hear this strange crackling sound in the brush that didn't match how those animals move. It was more deliberate, almost like something large was trying to move quietly, but couldn't quite manage it. I redirected my lantern toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. About 10 feet away from my gear, moving quickly up the riverbank, was something I still can't fully comprehend. It was massive, not like anything I've ever encountered in all my years in these swamps. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a build that made it look like it weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in long, dark hair, not fur like a bear, but more like hair that hung several inches long. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and there was almost no visible neck between the shoulders and what I assume was its head. What struck me most were its proportions. The arms were long, really long, and they swung naturally as it climbed up the bank. The way it moved was unsettling. Despite its size, it moved with this surprising agility and power. It navigated the uneven terrain and steep slope without slowing down at all, like the darkness and rough ground were nothing to it. I only saw it for maybe 3 or 4 seconds before it disappeared into the trees, and during that entire time, its face was angled away from me. I never got a look at its features. The strangest part was that I wasn't immediately afraid. Shocked, yes, confused, absolutely, but not terrified like you'd expect. The creature seemed more startled by my light than anything else. It wasn't acting aggressive, it was just leaving, quickly. It almost seemed like it had come down to the river's edge to forage, and my return had interrupted it. That theory was confirmed when I finally snapped out of my frozen state and checked my rock pool. 2 of my 4 fish were gone, a bass and a bream. Whatever this thing was, it had helped itself to half my catch while I was upstream. A minute or 2 after it disappeared, I heard this loud crash about 200 or 300 yards downstream. The sound of a large rock or log smashing through tree branches. It seemed like the creature was continuing to move away from me, which I took as a good sign. I'd like to say I was brave enough to keep fishing or even to carefully investigate, but that would be a lie. I quickly packed up my remaining fish and gear, kept my lantern on high beam, and got the hell out of there. The walk back to my truck felt 10 times longer than it had earlier that day. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made my heart race. When I got home, my wife immediately knew something was wrong. I was pale and still shaking slightly. I told her what happened, and to her credit, she didn't dismiss it or laugh it off. She's seen me rattled by things in the outdoors before, like the time I nearly stepped on a massive cottonmouth, but never like this. In the days that followed, I obsessively researched Florida wildlife, trying to find a rational explanation. Black bears can stand on their hind legs, but they don't walk that way, especially not with the speed and agility I witnessed. The proportions were all wrong anyway. Bears have shorter arms and a distinctive profile. This was something else entirely. I've only told a handful of people, my wife, 2 close friends who I trust won't think I'm crazy, and eventually I contacted a wildlife researcher who specializes in the big cypress ecosystem. The researcher listened without judgment and admitted there have been other unusual reports from that general area over the years, though nothing quite as detailed as my encounter. It's been 6 months now, and I've only been back to Big Cypress twice since then, both times in broad daylight and with a fishing buddy. I haven't returned to that specific spot, not out of fear exactly, but because I don't know how to process what I saw. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story before that night, I'd probably think they were exaggerating or had seen a bear in poor lighting. But I know what I saw. It moved upright with a fluidity and purpose that no bear possesses. Its proportions, size, and movement pattern simply don't match any known animal in Florida, or anywhere else I'm familiar with. I don't use the term Bigfoot or skunk ape, because those names come with all sorts of baggage and preconceptions. I'm not claiming to know what it was, I'm just sharing what I experienced exactly as it happened. Sometimes I think about how that creature must have approached silently enough to take fish from just a few yards away from my lantern without me noticing. It makes me wonder how many times I've been watched in the wilderness without ever knowing it. That thought keeps me awake some nights. The most frustrating part is having no proof. It happened so quickly that I didn't even think about the phone in my pocket. Not that it would have captured much in that lighting anyway. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes, and the certainty that something unusual calls the Big Cypress Preserve home. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just putting this out there in case someone else has had a similar experience. And if you fish or hike in remote areas of the Big Cypress, especially at night, maybe keep your catch a little closer and your eyes open a little wider.